Hey, Bitcoin wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to episode 74 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. This is where we talk hard talk about the hardest form of money as we transition to a world of Bitcoin artificial intelligence and central bank digital currencies. Each week we go live and I discuss what happened this week in Bitcoin, this week in macro, and this week in geopolitics. And the main focus of today is we're going to be discussing how the energy markets are being affected right now and how Bitcoin reacts to it, how sovereign wealth funds are recollaborating their wealth around what's happening in Bitcoin macro and geopolitics, and then also the Bitcoin arms race that we are experiencing now that America has made it official and announced through executive order their Bitcoin strategic reserve in a way that may not require congressional approval. So we're going to be going through all of that. Really in the first section, I think the main thing that's happened this week that we'll be going through is the move that Abu Dhabi has made. And it didn't really get as much attention as it should because people were too focused on the stock market crash and the reaction in the Bitcoin and crypto prices accordingly. I'm going to go through everything that happened there. We definitely had a stock market correction, and there were definitely some changes in the oil price in line with what we've been covering on Bitcoin Hard Talk. And then finally, in the geopolitical section, we're going to go through what the Syria situation means, the latest in Palestine, the latest in Ukraine, and how this all fits together in order to be able to transition and prepare for this world of Bitcoin, AI, and CBDCs. If we haven't met already, my name is Simon Dixon. I spent over 2 decades obsessing over monetary reform, and that took me through to Bitcoin investing and money. We're coming up on 25 years now that we've been at this. And so right now, we're going to get right into Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 74, this week in Bitcoin. Okay, so let's run through the news that happened this week in Bitcoin. Right. The bit that I think slipped through people's minds is that there was a big announcement and everyone was focused on whether Trump and his family had invested in Binance US, which is the non-news. What the real news was is that Binance actually had the largest investment ever in crypto by Abu Dhabi. And Abu Dhabi has a sovereign wealth fund called MGX, and it pledged $2 billion to Binance. Now, the reason this is significant is for several reasons. If you remember in the past, we covered in previous blogs, you can check them out on simondixon.com or on my YouTube channel, or get yourself a free membership to the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal where you can go through all the archives. But one of them, we covered the whole Binance US hostile takeover. And that was where Binance essentially had a bit of a controlled demolition by the US government. It's got 260 million users. And they fined Binance $4.7 billion. They did a negotiation with CZ that he only gets 4 months in prison, which he has served now. He has to step down as CEO, and they implanted their own compliance department. And then I went through exactly how they weaponized that in order to shut down accounts as part of the geopolitical warfare when they were firing financial weapons of mass destruction. Well, that was where it was. So if you go through, and I was at the Chengdu conference when CZ left OKX, the exchange, one of the largest exchanges in China. And then he was, pitching and did in a couple of weeks the launch of the BNB token and Binance the exchange. And shortly after, he was pretty much chased out of China. He went to Japan, where he was chased out of Japan. And then in America, they decided to do this controlled demolition. So on the big, economies, China, Japan, and US, and including UK and various other jurisdictions, they all, really came after Binance. Now, this created a strategic opportunity for the jurisdiction that has been adjusting, UAE, to getting a regulatory environment up together, doing Bitcoin mining IPOs, and really collaborating itself for the industry and understanding the Bitcoin proof of work is, in fact, one of the most geopolitically strategic and important energy plays in the market. Now, it requires a bit of understanding to get there, especially from sovereign nations, but Abu Dhabi are definitely there. And so what Abu Dhabi is doing is, because it is pretty much the center of the world, it sits between, the capital markets of the Shanghai Stock Exchange, the Tokyo Stock Exchange, the Hang Seng, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, and then the large Western markets like in Europe, the DAX, the CAC, the London Stock Exchange, and of course, the king of all capital markets at the moment, which is going through a serious recollaboration that we will be discussing in the macro section, which is, of course, the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. It is looking, I believe, to implement, and this is a multi-year play from my speculation, to actually turn Binance and its strategic investment into a leapfrogging capital markets. Now, throughout my career and at Bank to the Future, we have very much been involved in investing in companies that are looking to use our industry in order to recollaborate financial markets and capital markets, whether it be in 2014, we launched the first ever Bitcoin bond. And we also invested in companies like Securitize, which were creating, ways of doing share transfers on a blockchain and being a transfer agent, various other things. And we've invested in various security tokens over its time. But there was always a few problems. One, it didn't have the regulatory environment. So we created several broker dealers, and then there was hostile environments in the US. But it never quite had the regulatory structure. And then when it did have the regulatory structure, it took away so much liquidity that it ended up being a low liquid, inferior product. Well, when you take a tax haven, a tax neutral environment in the center of the world, and you combine that with a 260 million database, and that database is pretty much crypto native. So these are people that have been used to being expelled from the banking system, having to do peer-to-peer fiat currency rails, which Binance built. And also, when they did the controlled demolition, they wiped out its stablecoin, but it had traction in the stablecoin. But now we're moving to an environment where you're putting, treasuries on blockchains to create these tokenized real world assets. And then it will be securities and all these things. But to be able to do that, I believe that this is a play to make a strategic investment. What are sovereign wealth funds? Well, they only invest strategically when it is a strategic play for the country. So I believe that they would like to leapfrog capital markets. And of course, if this can be done natively on chain, where you can take securities off exchanges and over to other exchanges, rather than people saying I have to list on the New York Stock Exchange and then I dual list on the Tokyo Stock Exchange, but you can't take your securities cross markets, I think this could be a leapfrogging of capital markets. Now, if you combine them through stablecoins, Bitcoin, we're getting more and more traction. Now, stablecoins are being built on top of Lightning, on top of Bitcoin, and that market is only going to progress and get further and further and further. Then, of course, all the other markets are going to want some of that liquidity that is built into this market. And some of the public mining companies, they went live on the Abu Dhabi Stock Exchange. They got some of the largest capital markets, the largest sources of funds in the Middle East that are investing in Bitcoin mining. And if you are also one of the world's most important oil producers and gas producers, then you can take some of that gas. And of course, the play for the Middle East is to use Bitcoin proof of work in order to optimize efficiency, diversify markets, and then build the whole thing on top of Bitcoin, Lightning, stable coins, and various other things, and then put the securities on blockchains and use stable coins in order to bring everything into the market in the center of the universe. And this could be a drain as we are having these fights. For example, the euro dollar is going through a currency war right now, at the same time as the petrodollar going through a currency war right now. But if you can do these on-ramps where you have stable coins, which are essentially full reserve banking, which are competing with fractional reserve banking, and now we're having the adjustments to a country's going to choose central bank digital currencies or stable coins, and they don't compete with Bitcoin because Bitcoin's more on the savings side of the market, but you can build on top of this technology. I see an amazing play to recollaborate financial markets, disrupt capital markets, leapfrog. And quite frankly, there couldn't be a better location to see that opportunity. And then all the other surrounding nations, if we can move from a movement away from the petrodollar so that the dollar proof of weapons network is not weaponizing violence and destruction, and the model of America becoming a regional power and therefore exiting the region, if we can move, and we'll cover more in the geopolitical section, how we get there, to an environment more centered around peace, and we can now have these capital inflows, and you can have dollar stable coins and Bitcoin as savings, this transition that we're all going through could be a real net positive for the world. It's going to be absolutely fascinating to watch. Some jurisdictions will try to centralize it. Others will look to do it in a decentralized way. And we will make sure that we are covering that whole transition together. But I do believe that this is a strategic play to leapfrog capital markets and use stable coins to reverse the dollar milkshake theory and the dollar proof of weapons network that has caused so much violence, destruction globally through all these covert wars that are trying to get the world addicted to dollars through the International Monetary Fund and that network that it was created around the Bank for International Settlements, the International Monetary Fund, the Federal Reserve, the network of central banks that were created from the Bank of England. So this is another tool. We've now got Bitcoin, we got stable coins, and now we're getting into capital markets. We envisioned this a long time ago. Way back in 2012, we were all, when Bitcoin was 3 years into its experiment, we were playing around with colored coins, and then we launched the first stable coins in around 2014. And then we were looking at how stock markets can be disrupted. Lightning Network didn't exist. So then you had things that would just spam the network. But now we're at a time when the technology is really getting to that place where all of this can happen as well. The requirement for it really to have that, that frictionless flow is a tax neutral environment, which is why I think investing $2 billion in Binance, and if this is a play, not just to list Binance on a legacy stock exchange, but actually fulfill the vision of using, tokenized assets. I think this with that level of 260 million users, this could solve simultaneously the tax neutrality with the regulatory environment to make this possible, with the liquidity and traction. And so that is what I believe we are seeing right now. And I think that's why we had a bit of FUD from Wall Street Journal, but a bit of a defensive play where suddenly, the Abu Dhabi exchange and the US side were thinking, well, hold on, America wants to be crypto capital of the world. And so, there was a bit of a defensive play in order to see if the Trump administration could invest in the Binance US branch, which is interesting because if you remember when we covered the Binance story, it was in those stablecoin rails between Binance US and Binance International that was one of the tools that was weaponized in order to get that controlled, that hostile takeover by the US government of Binance. It's interesting that those rails are where we're going next. And now we're under a new administration in the US, and we're going to have the stablecoin regulations based upon everything we've been covering in the US. So anyway, I do believe, and this is speculation, they haven't confirmed anything, But this is a play at leapfrogging capital markets into tokenized exchanges. And I do think that this is going to be a multi-blockchain world. And I do think the blockchain, race or arms race, as we can call it, I do think that the scalability and privacy enhancements of Lightning built on top of Bitcoin, even though there may be a few different journeys along that way and it may be multi-chain, I think it's going to be a really important move. And that's why it's good timing that we're starting to get the first round of stable coins on top of Lightning. Anyway, I think this is a massive play for the future of capital markets. It really wasn't priced in at the moment, and it's really just an indication of how much further we have to go. We got peer-to-peer fiat rails where people are able to connect together and be able to go through the legacy system in order to offboard onto these stablecoin rails as well. And obviously the energy arms race of those that are utilizing Bitcoin proof of work to have a very efficient way of mining those last Bitcoins. We've got another over 100 years of mining, but there's only another 1 million left. And as the market cap goes up and up and up, we're seeing that the hash rate is going up and up and up, which means that we're getting more and more secure. And so if we ever have these big corrections that lead to some miners being unprofitable, we get the difficulty rate adjustment. And then that makes some miners unprofitable, others are profitable. And the whole system has just been designed in this beautiful, apolitical, geopolitically neutral. And the fact that we're getting these Middle Eastern plays, as well as, there was an element of a lot of the industry originally was in China. They made some bad moves. Some of that industry then went to America. And obviously, we're seeing many of the BRICS nations, and we'll cover more of those announcements. And we're getting this really nice balance. And especially as if the US dollar proof of weapons network is now going to, we'll cover this more in the macro section, going through a weakening of the dollar in order to rebuild its manufacturing base so that it can, actually be more of an exporter and an internal manufacturing base. Then we could see much of those capital markets redistribute away from what's called the dollar milkshake theory, where everything's being sucked up and countries can no longer invest in their own countries. But if this could be a re-collaboration where not everything is lent to the US government and then it's weaponized through the US dollar proof of weapons network, this is perfect currency mechanisms and capital market mechanisms in order to get an environment that could wave in, I guess we could call it, the next fourth turning. So this is a very important thing. It is an energy arms race, which is why we're seeing so much of changes in the market in order to make sure that the energy flows, the natural gas flows, the oil flows, the Belt and Road initiatives, the regional side of America now. What is the role of the European Union? We'll cover all of this in the macro section. But Bitcoin is really having an impact in these different areas, as whether people know it or not, the Bitcoin is the perfect solution to sit in the middle and create an element of harmony where Bitcoin is the regulator of the regulator for these fiat currency rails. As we transition to this world of artificial intelligence, where I believe governments won't be able to collect tax or regulate, so we're going to be using technology in order to regulate as these borders break down in this technocratic world that we're kind of moving into. So Bitcoin mining would certainly be a play that they would be doing it. And even though America has announced their Bitcoin strategic reserve, I think it would be very dumb and naive not to think that various regions in the Middle East have been accumulating their Bitcoin strategic reserves. And there is a reason why the price is down, because after America announced their Bitcoin strategic reserve, those that are the controllers of capital markets can do some short-term manipulation in order to oppress the price for a little bit longer so that nation states can accumulate the Bitcoin they need in order to be relevant in this new arms race. And of course, you should be taking advantage of that. Own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month. We cover the rules every time I try to remind you, and sit back and enjoy it, because the lower the price goes, the more Bitcoin you get to buy for your fiat currency in this digital scarcity fixed supply asset that is recollaborating all those markets around the world. So there was a bit of a rumor, and this may have been FUD. It may have been bad journalism, or it may have been an element of truth. But immediately after at the same time as the Abu Dhabi $2 billion announcement, Trump's family, the Wall Street Journal said that they're in talks to acquire a stake in Binance US. This is, basically Trump's family have been positioning themselves in order to profit from what I consider to be the asset stripping and corporate raiding of the proof of weapons network as it transitions to this new world of stable coins and Bitcoin strategic reserves, in order to have the tools it needs to take out the Federal Reserve proof of weapons network, or at least compete with it. And at the same time, transitioning to who are going to be the stable coin issuers when this, the banking system and the shareholders of the Federal Reserve decide that they need to adjust to this, and we get this deleveraging moment, and many of the things that are happening that we're watching in real time right now. So anyway, of course, Trump is launching his own NFT collections, launching DeFi platforms on top of Ethereum, launching stable coins that he said are going to be backed by US treasuries, launching meme coins for himself and his wife, launching Bitcoin ETFs, launching social networks. They're going to be connected with NFT marketplaces and everything, because quite frankly, Trump is using the fact that he is being paid by his lobby groups to transition all of America's assets over to this transition of the technocracy. He wants to make sure that his family gets a stake in it, as it were. And so now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But CZ, the founder, or the ex-founder, the ex-CEO that is still the major shareholder in Binance, this hostile saga continues. But he said he refuted the claim and said that the Trump administration, is not, may not be involved in that. But at the same time, there was hints that CZ is trying to get a presidential pardon to take away the problem of that 4-month sentence that he saw. So with the Trump administration and America, we've always said, in order to understand what comes next, don't listen to a word the politicians say, follow the money, and you can get yourself ahead of everything. Right, so what else is happening in the US dollar proof of weapons network during this transition? Well, the Utah Senate didn't do a Bitcoin strategic reserve for its state. Bad mistake. They'll pivot, come back later. But the first states that actually do this are going to be the ones that benefit from being able to protect themselves from the potential dismantling of the US dollar proof of weapons network. And of course, shout out to Thomas Massey, who got a lot of attacks this week. Thomas Massey, always sticking to his principles and exposing various elements of the proof of weapons network, like the AIPAC influence of the Israeli lobby that bribes all the politicians in order to be a vital part of propping up the petrodollar through destabilizing regions. He's always done a lot to expose that politicians and Congress members are essentially fake democracies, because they're bought for by the military industrial complex, the banking lobby, the proof of weapons network, big pharma, the Israeli lobby, and the important lobbies that are able to exert influence over this proof of weapons network. Well, anyway, when that happens, Utah does not have a Bitcoin strategic reserve yet, but it did launch a Bitcoin bill, and it passed. And this is to safeguard the right to self-custody which is hugely important, and to safeguard the Bitcoin mining industry. So this means that the state can engage in Bitcoin mining, individuals can engage in Bitcoin mining, and if your state does not protect you, you can at least self-custody Bitcoin, because you've got to take care of yourself first before you start taking care of your communities, countries, and other parts of the world as well. So that is very good things to see. We also started to see this controlled demolition of the corrupt Fed-installed SEC chair Gary Gensler, now that he is gone. And he was implementing a Fed-first policy for companies like BlackRock to try and take the industry, our industry, and hand it over to the globalist large controllers of financial assets like BlackRock. There was Operation Choke Point 2.0, where the Federal Reserve and the SEC engaged in rampant corruption with agents like SBF that was implanted in our industry for FTX, and Alex Majinsky, that was implanted into Celsius. Basically these that recollaboration, as it were, to take over the industry, approved the Bitcoin ETFs, as we've always covered. Well, now the new SEC, which is not, I believe, working for a Fed-first policy. Instead, it is working for a technocrat-first policy. So we have exchanged, corruption from the Fed proof of weapons network to corruption from artificial intelligence generated stable coins and other rails, which is what Trump is delivering, the asset stripping from one form of corruption to another form of corruption, but keeping the model the same, which we'll cover more in the macro section. But the US SEC has stated that no longer requires crypto companies to register as trading systems. So this is going through a deregulation environment at the same time as defining what the regulations are going to look like, so that the industry can prevail and move to the next stage. The Senator Lummis, Cynthia Lummis, who's been working on the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve, she actually reintroduced the bill, and there's now a 2025 version of the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve Bill. It's called the Bitcoin Act, and now it has been adjusted slightly, maybe for political feedback or whatever it needs to do, but it's now got stronger backing after the 2024 version. And it was, kind of stalled with the committee before that. So it's come back for the 2025 version. And the bill now basically mandates that there would need to be a fixed 200,000 Bitcoin annual purchase by the Treasury. Now, it's important that it's the Treasury and not the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve will strengthen the proof of work network debt-based Ponzi scheme. Whereas the Treasury are able to have a vital tool in case it needs to change and have a monetary reform, which it needs to do if it wants to actually transition to an environment of sustainability rather than this multi-decade unnatural 1913 Federal Reserve Ponzi scheme that transitioned America into $36 trillion of debt and $250 trillion of commitments, all for the profits of the banks that are the owners and controllers of those globalist financial rails that have no America First agenda and would just simply dump the dollar as soon as it's no longer useful, and just transition the world to the next world order, where they can take the capital away from there over to another country. And set the rails in place as Bitcoin resists against it. And now they could not beat us, so they had to join us. So the bill anyway says that the US government would need to purchase 200,000 Bitcoin. And the important part is that we have our ability to self-custody, so that as governments try to, gobble up some of that Bitcoin, take it out of the market in order to work on their national security arms races, so that they've got tools that can be used as their currencies become less and less relevant or refinance or go through changes. They have their bill there anyway. Now, the most important part about this is people will say, oh yeah, everyone wants governments to buy Bitcoin. No, that's not the point here. The governments don't need to buy Bitcoin. Bitcoin does not need governments. In fact, it's a natural thing that when you create a scarce asset that goes through this 4-year cycle that we have experienced throughout Bitcoin's entire history, and it is digital scarcity that's providing the ability for people to exit the fiat currency rails and beat the inflation that is created by the proof of weapons network without having to go into debt slavery. Naturally, everyone will want some of that. And so I'd love for it to be just for individuals, but Bitcoin doesn't care. So governments can buy it, corporations can buy it, individuals can buy it, even central banks can buy it if they want to. That is the nature of a free market. But the point is, Bitcoin doesn't need those people. They need Bitcoin. And that is the game theory that is playing out right in front of us. The new bill has kind of some stickier rules around not being able to sell and make sure it is a hodl position. So now that we've got those announcements and America's going through its Bitcoin strategic reserve strategy, we had the reaction from other countries. I've already covered the Abu Dhabi capital markets. I don't believe they want to announce strategic reserves because they'd rather accumulate more. But we did have an announcement and several announcements from those that are, weaponized by the financial weapons of mass destruction, like sanctions, which is leading to this de-dollarization at the moment, because covert wars are being fought, where you have these weapons cells, multinational organizations like NATO, which are there in order to create the fear of war through intelligence agencies, so that whenever the Fed prints money, it can go into the hands of where the lobby groups have done it. They can wipe out the middle class America, make sure that the corporations that are bribing the politicians get the money that's printed. That creates inflation, and it benefits those that are able to get closer to borrowing at 0% from the proof of weapons network, or directly get investment from the government into those organizations. You got this kind of weaponization of the dollar. That's why it's a proof of weapons network, because it really recollaborates based upon how much is spent on weapons and violence. And so, what we're seeing with NATO right now is that NATO was used in order to use organizations like the CIA to expand NATO into jurisdictions, interrogate wars, so that there is retaliations. And that is what we have seen with the Russia-Ukraine situation. And so in retaliation to that, the Bank of Russia, the Central Bank of Russia, has decided to allow limited crypto purchases for investors through their proof of weapons network. And Russia is a full-blown military industrial complex. But the difference is that America privatizes. So you have crony capitalism, its weapons industry, its oil industry, and they have more authoritarian regimes, but that makes them more efficient in terms of not having to mess around too much with politics. Both models are awful, but you have these two different models that work side by side. One is controlled by billionaires corrupting the system with fake democracies, where there's all this distraction with left and right, inflation that wipes out the middle class, and then all of the assets are stripped over to those that are the most corrupt. Whereas you have a proof of weapons network like Russia, where you have more authoritarianism, but you don't have the pretense of democracy. You have a slightly different model, and everyone knows what they get. And there's a benefit to it. They pay less tax because resources are used for state. And then you have these semi-capitalism models now the unnatural models like the Soviet Union and the disaster of communism has fallen. Once the proof of weapons network made all their money out of communism, the ideology has fallen, but it was all about redistributing wealth to those that benefit from it. And so Russia is now they made a second announcement. So they're allowing their financial institutions in order to make limited purchases into that. And at the same time, there was a confirmation from Reuters that Russia is using both Bitcoin, Ethereum, and stablecoins for oil transactions with both China and India. And that is really interesting because here is the hypocrisy, right? We know that the dollarization, the dollar proof of weapons network was used in order to, confiscate and sanction a bunch of money, destroy economies, use NATO in order to expand wars, and then use their control over media to make it look like America's, exporting democracy, when the reality is they're sacrificing regions like Europe and killing Ukrainians in order to prop up the profits of the military-industrial complex. But at the same time, the hypocrisy of it is everyone sanctions and that they confiscate money. So the European Union and America confiscated 350 billion from the central bank. And then they use sanctions to weaken the economy. But what actually happened? In the end, the natural gas that was going from Russia to Germany, the CIA blew up the pipeline, made it where you have to buy, 100% more expensive natural gas from America. That destroyed Europe, weakened Europe, created a dependency upon America, which is completely being weakened right now and is in a dire recession. And as a result of that, Russia just simply took its oil and gas, and sold it to India. And then India started strengthening the BRICS corridor by clipping the cheap gas that it was getting from Russia and then exporting it and selling it to Europe. So Europe just ended up getting sacrificed. The flows don't change. You just end up using these currency wars in order to destroy economies and kill people. And that's the nature of propping up these debt-based Ponzi schemes that central banks created in order to get governments deeper and deeper into debt to fund their wars. But anyway, so now they've been using stablecoins, Bitcoin and Ethereum to trade with each other to facilitate these transactions. And that is creating the type of adoption for when they launch their currency. They can also, at BRICS, go through the leapfrog. And if everyone is building in the global south their Bitcoin strategic reserves, then they get to have the system that could solve the problem of their gold-backed currency that they're aiming to launch at some point. Not sure if they are. They didn't say it was a strategic goal. They were going to be working on plugging these rails together in order to do barter trades using blockchains to facilitate such transactions. But they were able to, go through these different new rails, and that took away the power of SWIFT, which is what a vital part and tool of the US dollar proof of weapons network. And so this was the recognition that Russia won the financial war, the covert war that was being fought, and we're seeing right now the military war as US retreats and starts to change the model that we're experiencing, and we'll cover more in the geopolitical section. We've got the Middle East energy play, capital markets play. We got the BRICS corridor building probably strategic reserves and embracing the industry more, as we know they're probably mining it at the sovereign level. We've got the America being able to protect itself from the Fed using these tools and Bitcoin strategic reserves. And all of that is connecting the rails together. And what is Europe doing? Well, the European Union announced that, of course, there was a hostile takeover of Europe and all the European members by the European Central Bank. That was the end of, the project of the Cold War. was to take away the currencies of all of those countries and consolidate them under one power structure so that you can have these dictators. You know, the petrodollar was making sure democracy never happens in countries like the Middle East because they want to negotiate with dictators. In the Eurodollar market, they just said, take all these countries and package them up into one central bank called the European Central Bank. And then those petrodollars and eurodollars can be used in order to get more violence, death, and destruction to a Fed first policy, so that they can get the world addicted to dollars and use war and violence in order to get there. And so the European Central Bank, of course, is going down. We've been sacrificed. We've wiped out the Europeans. We've put Europe into recession. America blew up Nord Stream pipeline. NATO, managed to get Europe into war, weaken all those economies, strip those economies away, install corrupt politicians that are Fed first policies, ECB first policies. And now we've got peak record centralization where our partners in the Middle East can essentially, through OPEC Plus, determine whether there's inflation or not. And we can use this network of central banks to asset strip all of the people of all of their wealth in order to, prop up this proof of weapons, fiat currency, debt-based Ponzi scheme. And we need an experiment. We need a sucker. We need a region that doesn't have sovereignty and is full of leaders that are not acting in the interest of the European people. We're talking to you, Keir Starmer in the UK. We're talking to all of the puppet governments across the European Union. The European Central Bank has said by October 2025, the ECB will launch its digital euro, its central bank digital currency, which is the final part of the puzzle in destroying Germany, World War I, World War II, in installing the Soviet Union in Russia, in funding through the Federal Reserve and taking capitalism and indebting the US government, in dismantling the UK government when the Bank of England took over and used World War I in order to recollaborate the world, handing over parts of Palestine to install the CIA, the MI6 and CIA into through Israel into the Middle East, create violence across the whole region, corrupt, take over all of the corrupt the leaders and the monarchs, don't allow democracy to prevail, and complete the hostile takeover of the European Union as well, and install a ECB, all connected through Switzerland and the Bank for International Settlements. And this is really the end of the project, the hostile takeover of install the European Union, install the European Central Bank, and then get a full central bank digital currency to complete the complete takeover, where they can now programmatically say, you must spend money in this direction, program negative interest rates in, programmatically state that if you don't get this vaccine, then we can say you will be punished financially, or whatever policy they want. They can use Europe in order to exert it. And what is needed in order to get through that mission? Well, firstly, you need to take the proof of weapons network, the war machine, and you need to move it over from America through NATO into the European Union. And so now the European Union is saying Putin is Hitler and playing this theatrics in order to say, right, we need $800 billion so that we can inject it into the German proof of weapons network, the military industrial complex, UK military industrial complex, France military industrial complex. And of course, we need to make sure that all that money goes back into the American military industrial complex through Palantir, who is building AI, artificial intelligence, and is using that to plug into drones, F-36, F-35 fighter jets that it's selling all around the world, and beta testing genocide and occupation as a service in Gaza right now in order to be able to sell those artificial intelligence to governments all around the world and make sure that America gets all those data centers, all of that energy, and make sure that it wins the AI race against China, with Abu Dhabi probably making a play in the middle in top of these capital markets and dismantling the petrodollar, dismantling the euro dollar, but making Europe the new war machine in order to print money, get that money, and sacrifice Europeans that don't know what is coming from them. And they're just choosing between eating and heating, wondering why is everybody getting wealthy and I'm trying to just live to pay the debt of the banks that benefited and created this whole system in the first place. And so that's the transition, the other side that we are seeing. What did they have to say in order to create this theatrics? After that theatrics with Zelensky that led to this transition, that led to the money printing, that led to NATO expansion, that said every country asset strip your economies further and spend 5% on military. And a chunk of that will go to America. Well, of course, the EU come out and say, well, Trump's support for the crypto industry could undermine Europe's monetary sovereignty and financial stability. This is exactly what we had after World War I when this network was created in the first place. You had the installation of the Federal Reserve to make people think that fake crony capitalism in America was actual capitalism, and then use the Bolshevik Revolution in order to create communism. And you had the uprising, which replaced Russia with the Soviet Union. And then you fund both sides of that mechanism, which is what the Bank of England and its network did from there. Use war. And now we're doing the same thing. We're saying, America, you can be a stablecoin technocracy, while Europe, you can be a central bank digital currency. And we can use and get people to spend more on death, destruction, and violence by having this fake cold proxy war between America and Europe. And we can use energy from both the Middle East, Russia, in order to create this forever war type of environment. But there was a resistance against it. And that was the BRICS corridor. They did not plan that China would become a superpower and then align with Iran, India, and Russia and the global South. And then China started investing through the Belt and Road Initiative in building up the economies that were destroyed by the International Monetary Fund covert regime change, the CIA, Mossad, and MI6. They didn't plan for that. And in 2008, we had Bitcoin's proof of work, which then created a bottom-up resistance movement to fight the control of the central banking system. And now we get to opt out. Now we get to boycott and hold Bitcoin in self-custody and say, F you to the proof of weapons network. You guys do what you need to do, and eventually you will need us. And you know what? That AI, those social network control mechanisms, those data plays, those big data plays, those energy plays, that energy is going to be plugged into peaceful Bitcoin proof of work. And eventually artificial intelligence will be decentralized, open source, and just like Bitcoin, create a resistance. And those social networks, that data will be peer-to-peer, where you can transport it for you by putting it on decentralized and open source networks like Bitcoin, so that when that AI comes through, when China says we want to control this part of the world, and when America says we want to control the world, and the globalists, which control both networks, they say we want to control the world through this corruption, we can have this resistance against it, thanks to Satoshi Nakamoto and game theory and riba-free, interest-free money that we were always taught was the root cause of all the problems. If you go back to the theology, if you go back to the pre-central banking, scholarly studies of economics before we were told there's one version of capitalism and communism and socialism, it always predicted that interest and usury would be the destruction that we are witnessing today. And so we created an antithesis to it with Bitcoin. And so now the different banks and financial institutions are saying, well, we need to hedge. And so Spain's largest and, well, second largest bank, BBVA, decided that it is going to approve and offer Bitcoin and Ethereum trading and try and earn its fees. It couldn't beat us, so they joined us. It doesn't matter. Fortunately, proof of work was designed where it doesn't matter who owns it. And that was one of the key distinctions between proof of stake and proof of work. Proof of stake, the more those people own, the more they control the network. Proof of work, it doesn't matter who owns it. And you can hold it in self-custody in order to have this two-tiered system that they may try and control half of it. But fortunately, the vast majority of Bitcoin is held in self-custody as well. And we had Thailand's SEC and regulators came out and now officially approved Tether's USDT as a compliant cryptocurrency. So we're seeing this movement towards stablecoin regulations. And also Japan came out and announced that they are cutting tax on Bitcoin from its 55% down to 20%. So treating Bitcoins differently to other assets as part of its broad cryptocurrency reform strategy. Now, Japan was always big in this industry. We had the first crazy exchanges like Mt. Gox in Japan, some of the biggest hacks of centralized exchanges like CoinCheck. And it really was ahead of the curve in terms of Bitcoin acceptance as well. But now it's starting to recognize that. But, you know, the Bank of Japan is just one of the vital tools in allowing this speculative economy based upon free money from the Bank of Japan. And it was a mechanism of control after the New World Order was set up in the post-World War II era. But Japan is announcing that. On the corporate side, it looks like MicroStrategy, which is now called Strategy, which I've already started to speculate, I believe is a tool of the US government at this stage in order to accumulate as much Bitcoin as possible so that if America ever wanted to nationalize Strategy, you know, because it was too unnatural the way Michael Saylor came through, you know, just like SBF was a very unnatural, came out of nowhere and was perpetuated across all the platforms and went from 0 Bitcoin in Strategy to 500,000 Bitcoin in Strategy, more than the Chinese government, more than the US government, more than the UK government, the Kingdom of Bhutan, El Salvador, Ukraine, all of them combined. Strategy ended up owning, you know, approximately 500,000 Bitcoin. Now it announced that it is going to be raising $21 billion of perpetual preferred stock as we asset strip the legacy stock markets in order to hack the system, buy Bitcoin, and then it can create this essentially strategic reserve in case America wants to nationalize, give you a central bank digital currency or print a stable coin in exchange for those shares so that it could build its strategic stockpiles or reserves in an emergency scenario. And Michael Saylor was at the White House meeting and transitioned from a Bitcoin only to kind of a digital asset type of narrative based upon my belief that he is now an asset for intelligence and the US government or the proof of weapons network. Anyway, now we shall see whether in this harder market, because there is a lot of stress, we'll cover this in the macro section, you know, as America is being asset stripped by the Trump administration for the technocrats, the market's getting harder. So we'll see, is he able to raise that 21 billion? We'll see whether that is an effective strategy that still goes through into an oppressive market. And it kind of depends upon whether we have a breakaway of Bitcoin from the stock market, which would probably happen under an environment of stagflation, or does Bitcoin correct so that you can buy more and more cheap Bitcoin as it recollaborates to more of a global play rather than being dependent upon the US dollar proof of weapons network? and therefore it would be in line with the market. It kind of depends on several moves. And we don't really, it's hard to predict the market because we don't have markets. We have peak centralization. You're just dealing with government, central banks, and oil producers that are sitting around in meetings and deciding where the markets go. These are the global controllers of finance, and they're using jurisdictions and they're deciding what will happen. So we don't need to pretend they're free markets. It is the whims of what happens when they meet in Saudi Arabia, when they meet in these different jurisdictions, and decide what they're going to be doing. So the OCC, there was an announcement, which is the Office of Currency Commission, I believe, which is the regulator that sits under the Federal Reserve for the larger banks. They are now allowing the banks to custody crypto. And this is the Office of the Controller of Currency. Interesting name, right? This is different to the smaller banks, which can be hostile taken over, like FDIC, which is essentially an asset stripping organization that pretends like, they'll say, right, we'll guarantee $250,000 of bank deposits. But it just means they can take the smaller banks when the Federal Reserve manipulates rates in the economy for its larger bank shareholders that are in the OCC network. The FDIC banks can just be hostile taken over. They can be gobbled up. And there is a, crony capitalism in order to facilitate that. We saw that in 2022 when Operation Choke Point 2.0 was used in order to use a pump and dump scheme and oil prices negotiated between OPEC Plus and the Federal Reserve and the Biden administration. That was used in order to wipe out a chunk of the banks. And the two agents of that network were Peter Thiel, that told everyone to withdraw from Silicon Valley Bank, and Bill Ackman, that lobbied in order to get FDIC and the Fed and the taxpayer to underwrite the banking system so that they could asset strip it, take over the banks for free. But they created a new tool and said, we'll wipe out the three crypto-friendly banks, Silicon Valley Bank, Silvergate, and Signature. And that's an example of how FDIC is just a mechanism for asset stripping under the pretense of guaranteeing the system in a debt-based Ponzi scheme where there is more debt than money. And so therefore you inevitably have these events like long-term capital management, or the dot-com boom and bust, or the global financial crisis, and these different ones. So that is different from the FDIC banks. The FDIC banks were already able to custody crypto, but they made the rules where they have to end up with, if the price goes up, they end up with more assets. And so now we've got change in those rules, but now the OCC banks, the large ones, can also engage in the market. And a few more trends that we need to watch out for in the Bitcoin section is the connection between, now that many of the Bitcoin mining companies are also using their machine and their data centers in order to provide compute for artificial intelligence, we need to make sure that we're watching the big compute, the big data, and the artificial intelligence sector in its intersection as America and China try to control it. Middle East invests in both regions, and Bitcoin is providing the bottom-up decentralized movement. But we had a few movements in that China announced this essentially as next DeepSeek moment, where it unveiled, what's it called? Zukonji 3, which is a 105 qubit quantum computer that allegedly is 1 million times faster than the quantum computer that Google has released. So we're getting these real weapons being fired out there. And Bitcoin will have to, which is a global side, quantum resistant cryptography is something that eventually our market will need to adjust to. And that may be the next type of internal Bitcoin war as we figure out at what point to make that transition. And so we've seen this before, and we know that Bitcoin can adjust to it, and we know that the technology will exist. But anyway, China is starting to engage in these quantum computer wars with the American companies, and showing that that they are playing that race and not only having the narrative of they're just copying us, but actually they're innovating several times higher as well. This is why America needs to focus and win that race, and that is the race that will determine, I guess, the next phase of artificial intelligence. They also released a new AI agent called Mahus, and it is meant to be basically a lot more accurate than DeepSeek, and it can handle basically. It did a demo where it could handle finance, research, and more, and different types of activities, all autonomously and at the same time simultaneously. So this is the AI race that I think is requiring this transition from the petrodollar, euro dollar, and the violence of the proof of weapons network into America focusing and being a regional power as well. We had a little bit of narrative around as well. I just want to make sure, because it's important to recognize that the macro, geopolitical, and Bitcoin are all kind of combining into one important thing. But Trump put out a lot more narrative. We've covered this in previous broadcasts around why countries like Greenland need to be building their Bitcoin strategic reserves as a national security in a global arms race in order to have more leverage and negotiation power and more sovereignty. But Trump is recognizing that it started to put out offers to the people of Greenland as basically narratives around a way out of their European rule, a way out of Danish, the colonizers, come join the American colonizers. He was given some narrative around how, Denmark has been ruling Greenland with an iron fist since World War II, which is true. That was the proof of weapons network in the post-World War II order, where the Bretton Woods system was designed in order to take all of the gold from colonization, all of the gold from the Soviet Union, and transfer it over to America, while everyone has their currencies tradable against the dollar, and with a promise that it would be backed by all that gold that was stolen from via the British Empire over to the American Empire. And then they defaulted on that agreement in 1971 in order to fight the Vietnamese War, in order to tell everybody that we need that money for peace, of course, as they escalate those networks as well. Anyway, he's putting out a narrative there that it is time for Greenland to rejoin North America under the protection of the US dollar proof of weapons network. As I said, the reason this becomes important, as in previous broadcasts I've covered, is that if Greenland wants to actually increase its strength and independence, then it should be leveraging these natural resources in order to repurpose them with partnerships, but use that in order to build their own Bitcoin strategic reserves and become a small player in the arms race through partnership, in order to build more of its sovereignty. And it can sit between Europe and America and become an important player as well, or it can just be colonized from the European colonizers to the American local regional power colonization as well. I don't really take that seriously, but I do think it will be all part of that painting EU as a war machine, while painting America, which is the beneficiary of all this, into the propagators of peace. That's how this whole network is built together. But anyway, they could be using, it's too late now at this stage, but you should still be starting. Build your Bitcoin strategic reserves. It becomes an important part of David beating Goliath. And you can even pay your local people dividends in Bitcoin. We did this at Bank to the Future in 2014, where we built repurposing of Iceland energy to build out a data center for proof of work Bitcoin mining, which was powered by local volcano power. And we used the cold environment in order to use geothermal cooling of the rigs. And then we launched a Bitcoin bond, which was paying out daily dividends to anyone that was building their retirement plan through Bank to the Future. And we're starting to now get a lot of narrative around Bit bonds, where people can build products like what Strategy is using. You could offer, say, low interest bonds with a profit share on the growth of Bitcoin. I think this is going to become a really important play for countries as we move into, Abu Dhabi potentially being the center of global capital markets. And everyone has the opportunity to be a part of that. This really is a David beat Goliath moment as we watch El Salvador and their strategy persist. Anyway, once you've got Bitcoin strategic reserves, you can issue your own stable coins, and you can do that based upon the reserves, and play the structure as the game theory planes itself. And over time, you could be building your sovereign wealth fund as well, based upon and Greenland can become a David beat Goliath type of power. It can use it for its security and its independence, and it can make sure that it self-sustains itself without having to go into debt slavery, take International Monetary Fund money, which is the mechanisms for being colonized by either the British Empire, Chinese Empire, or American empires as well. And so this is the beauty. Singapore kind of proved it, that type of model, where it built sovereign wealth in order to make all of its citizens almost like shareholders in its economy, so they never have uprisings because they feel like they are a shareholder in their own economy. And it, used that wealth in order to make sure everyone owned their own property. And rather than creating this, a debt-based Ponzi scheme where all of the assets are stripped, you work on making it a joint mission. And Singapore's the perfect example of becoming a powerhouse. And now that opportunity is open to all sovereign nations. And here's the beauty of the whole thing. None of them have to do it. They can carry on. It will take them to World War III, or they can utilize Bitcoin proof of work in order to go to an environment of peace. But we can build our own financial independence through self-custody, through beating the inflation of the proof of weapons network by having a decent strategy. For those that want to build a strategy just like this, head over to simondixon.com. Later this year, every halving cycle, I release showing you exactly how I do it. For anyone who wants to do it, I'll be releasing a free video series. Just make sure you're on the mailing list at simondixon.com. Get your free membership to the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. And we're going to transition over to the second section, which is this week in macro. What I also need from you is a favor. Wherever you're watching this, whether you're watching on X, can you go to Simon Dixon on YouTube? Can you go to this video? Can you go on my channel and hit subscribe? When I started covering the geopolitical side, I went from a fast-growing YouTube channel to complete oppression. And what happened is a lot of what I was covering was very controversial content. But now, through the US aid and many of the files that have been dropped, what I was covering has proven to be factual. And so what I can do now is if I get to 100,000 subscribers, YouTube will put a blue check on my channel and they will review my channel. And I can prove to them that much of what you were censoring me for has now been released as fact. And so I'd like to get that review. And if you could do me a favor, I will keep creating this content for free, but I need to make sure I survive the algorithm. So hit the subscribe button, hit the bell symbol, put a comments down there, like the video, and make sure the algorithm gets scared. And I just get to that 100,000 subscribers, because at the moment I am in the death zone of the algorithm only going to my old users and not being used in order to go to new users. Right. So I'm going to take a quick break while you do that. I'll just grab some water and we're going to go through this week in macro in part 2 and this week in geopolitics in part 3. Hit that like button, hit the share now. Okay, welcome to part 2 of Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 74, where we're going to be covering everything that is happening this week in macro. So the Federal Reserve and the US Proof of Weapons Network released its numbers for CPI, which is a proxy of inflation. And you can look at different proxies. You can go to Trueflation. The problem with this proxy is that it's priced in the world reserve currency. And as you are pushing out more and more dollars through the Proof of Weapons Network to get everyone addicted to debt, you get this obfuscation of inflation because the goods are priced in the same currency that is being strengthened. And so you have this very hard mechanism for delivering the real inflation. The middle class feel wrecked and they're being told, but inflation isn't that problematic, because they used economics in order to say you must have 2% inflation. Now, the 2% inflation goal is no longer realistic. So the Fed is saying we won't do anything until we get towards that 2% goal. But it looks like 3% is the new 2%. And so therefore you have this battle between the Federal Reserve and Treasury, which is looking at doing potential monetary reform, potential Bitcoin strategic reserves, but also trying to pressure the Federal Reserve to lower rates because they have their own fiscal crisis. And the bank benefits from that. And the Fed is a organization where it works for its shareholders, which is the banks that benefit from all the debt and destruction. So you have this consumer price index, and that was a little bit of a stimulus to make sure that the market that was correcting had a little bit of life. And so inflation dropped to 2.8%, which is beating expectations of 2.9%. Now, it's not what the figure says, it's whether it beats expectations, because the market expects something. And so when it is better or lower inflation than the expected 2.9%, that is considered bullish for the market. And so, of course, Trump will say, we're controlling Biden inflation. And push that narrative as well. But what he wants to do is get the rates down so he can refinance the debt-based Ponzi scheme, and then try and get it where the Fed lowers those rates and prints more money in an economic stimulus through QE, reversing the QT, quantitative tightening scheme. And basically what we're seeing today, which is a potential government shutdown. Because Trump is pretending that we're going through a painful time in order to change the economy, where he's asking for $1.6 trillion of debt, saying that Doge is saving about $105 billion if you look at the debt clock. So pretending that we're saving money when actually he's asking for more money. And so people like Thomas Massie are saying, no. And then Democrats like Chuck Schumer are being weaponized in order to, try and get some of the things that they want, with this belief that the government could shut down. Now, that's being voted right now. And it did happen last time during the Trump administration. I think it was about 30 to 40 days, if memory serves me right, where the government couldn't pay any bills. It was shut down. And then they enter into this negotiation to get the rate up. But it's simply about crony capitalism happening, saying, put my stuff in there, get my money of the additional money that's printed over to my people that are paying me, give me my kickback, and then I will vote and agree. So Congress are just prostitutes for the fact that you just buy their vote, and then you can control power and you call it democracy. And so this figure... while it's coming down, it doesn't really reflect any of the changes that have happened so far. So there has been the tariff wars. There has been volatility in the market. There's been price adjustments. We're moving to what will be reciprocal tariffs on the 2nd of April, which hopefully will create more of an understanding without these different narratives that are causing lots of volatility. And also commitment from Trump to get the price of oil down. Now, we had that oil price correction. Last time I looked, I think we're at about $65, or I think it went down to a low of $62 from a peak of about 82. And it went beyond, it went during the last time the Fed did a pump and dump scheme to take down Silicon Valley Bank and various other things. We had this hike in oil price that led to the inflation that led to the collapse of the banks. And then the excuse for creating a new tool, more money printing, more lending. Expect a similar type of thing, but this time we're seeing the reversal of trying to get those oil prices down and those oil corrections. And so that is leading to a change in narrative. The narrative is now coming around. Are we in recession? Are we going to go into recession? Officially in 2022, it was in recession because it was defined as 2 quarters of negative or lower growth. And that happened, and then they kind of redefine it to make you think a little bit differently. But now there are talks around recession. Now, we know the game. If you get a recession, then you have less debt, which is less money. Less money equals less debt. And then you go into deflationary environment, which is a depression or recession, which the controllers of finance will never allow to happen. So you either get a pivot from the government on the fiscal side, where they say we could print a new stable coin, for example, and stimulate the economy, because they've got to get the votes. And the people that are paying will then kick in and say, if you don't get that stock price and if you don't wipe out middle-class America further, then we're going to vote the other side. And so the pivot has to happen. Or the Federal Reserve does the pivot and it moves to lower rates, QT, a debt-based Ponzi scheme, and further destruction, which is the Biden model as well. So it's the same model every time. It's just done under a different narrative, because they will never allow deflation to happen, because then the banks contract the amount of credit that they're creating. That makes money disappear. And then you enter into a depressionary or recessionary environment. And the controllers that own the government will not allow that to happen. And the banks that own the Federal Reserve, they'll say, let's just ride this donkey. Let's ride the US dollar proof of weapons network to full violence. And then we'll do a controlled transition like we did from the Bank of England to the Federal Reserve to whatever the artificial intelligence technocracy and whatever they've designed the system to be next. So, they won't allow GDP to go down. And what were they pushing GDP for? They said America is the largest economy in the world. But what was it? It was literally printing money, sending it to all sorts of corruptions from non-governmental organizations, using the IMF and NATO and the intelligence agencies to force countries to borrow these dollars and then spend it back in America so that it goes in the direction of the corrupt. And then they call it increase in GDP as all this unproductive spending is happening. I don't know how to estimate this, but my guess is that half of the stock market was just pumped up by the government, which is the very definition of socialism and crony capitalism, which is what the Federal Reserve was designed to do. And those that own the assets say, please pump the market further because I don't want my assets to go down. Because the reality is that America's GDP and everybody else, which are the derivatives on top of it, 9% inflation in America equals 900% inflation in Zimbabwe, says if you allow GDP to lower, then we get this recollaboration where we actually start stopping lending our money by buying bonds to the US government. And then we convert it back to our currency and we invest in our own economies. And then we have more money to work with BRICS and the Belt and Road Initiative. And America gets to build its regional by weakening the dollar and strengthening other currencies so it can rebuild its manufacturing base. And we enter into that. We are in that environment. Now, will America believe in capitalism? Well, no, it's the Federal Reserve in the market, which leads to asset stripping, which leads to corporate raiding, and then a reinvigoration of the proof of weapons network, with all those that benefit from it cheering along, saying capitalism is back. The government gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's why it's being told to you through Doge, we're saving all this money, but at the same time, we're threatening a government shutdown if you don't give us a lot more money as well. So it's completely fake. It's completely fake narrative. And, it is essentially reducing. We're seeing whether if you want, free markets again, you have to reduce the fiscal deficit. And that is the vast majority of dollars. And so you'd have to have a monetary reform at the same time, which is why I've always been saying, America, build your Bitcoin strategic reserves, release the corruption like USAID, National Endowment of Democracy, and then you can have the tools through stable coins, but you transition from one system to the other. But are you going to be doing these large stimulus based upon a debt-based Ponzi scheme? And that's the change that needs to happen. I have zero faith in governments doing it because I believe the systemic structural problem of the corruption of the fake democracies is what is making a recession never able to happen at the expense of middle class until eventually the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And then that leads to, the types of revolutionary movements that America has been inflicting upon African nations and Middle Eastern nations. And as Europe and America start fighting each other, you end up with, these types of things. But you need to protect yourself with Bitcoin. And that's the whole macro play we need to understand. So as I said, they're calling it austerity from the left democratic narrative. The MAGA narrative is saying we're winning. We are stamping out all the corruption. The Proof of Weapons Network is saying we'll give them freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach. If you speak against Mossad or anything, we'll stop all of the Jeffrey Epstein files, the 9/11 files, the JFK files from blaming it on where it actually came from. And instead, we'll say it's the CIA and we can blame it on the Democrats. And really, you're just recollaborating the exact same system, but creating that two-tiered narrative that makes people think they have an element of control of it as well. And as I said, it's good that they add the Doge savings to the US debt clock. If you type in Google US debt clock, you can see that the ticker symbol of the debt that the Proof of Weapons Network benefits from. And now they've created the amount of money that's being saved. Last time I looked, and it keeps changing, it was 175 billion, and then it moved to 105 billion. But you can keep monitoring that on the debt clock website. So we shall see what happens today. Does the government get a shutdown? The government is being weaponized to say, while we're saving 100 billion, we would like 1.65 billion of additional budget, discretionary budget for the Trump administration. And that is 47% more than what Obama's last budget was. And so, it's the same system, but different narrative. So anyone that fights against that is being, really weaponized, as it were. Thomas Massey, who exposes all of these things, like every Congress member has an AIPAC handler from the Israeli lobby. And he said, no, I will not allow for additional. We're trying to contract. He's doing the right thing. And suddenly Trump comes out and says, Thomas Massey, he does a campaign against him to try and get the MAGA crew to go nuts and turn against itself, even from within, at the same time as pushing it's the Democrats that are causing all the problem as well. And of course, the Israeli lobby likes it when you take the only person exposing the system, because then you can have a controlled demolition or the elimination of anyone that speaks against Israel, which clearly is showing that by being the only foreign agent that is able to bribe it and has all these NGO networks and has full congressional control, they get to perpetuate the Proof of Weapons Network, which is kind of what we'll be covering in the geopolitical side. America in its controlled demolition could win the AI race, but Israel in its occupation of all the Congress members wants it to go to war with Iran so that it can use the old model and it can continue to sit between China and America, steal America's technology and sell it to China and sit itself in the middle and push America into war by pushing the narrative of the forever wars, which is the old model. And that is the friction that you need to understand. And that's what we'll go through in the geopolitical side as well. Anyway, the 1.6 million, what is it being asked for? Well, it's looking for temporary increase in budget so that it can then use that money and then try and weaponize the Fed to reduce rates so it can restructure the debt-based Ponzi scheme and borrow more and create more dollars at the expense of middle-class America and middle-class world, because that inflation is exported. Okay. So that's the shutdown story. I'll cover it next week because it's happening in real time right now. But we'll see what happens there. Just so you know, it proposes a $6 billion increase in defense spending. Defense, which is saying we don't need those forever wars anymore. We're going to get NATO to pay for it. We're going to ask Europe to print money, spend it back into America to weaken the dollar to rebuild its manufacturing base and strengthen the euro and do a debt stimulus based upon Putin's stolen money. But at the same time, we want NATO to spend more and we want to sell more weapons and hand over the war machine to Europe as we rebuild the fact that we gave all of our defense to Ukraine, Israel, and the 100 proxy wars that they've been fighting. This is a real signal that the corruption is actually making America's real defense not work. And so it's been spent money. So budget is going into defending the borders, which is one thing the Trump administration has delivered. Absolutely credit where it's credit's due. In order to stop the fact that all these wars creates refugee crisis, and then everyone needs to get into the economy where their country is lending it to the US government because it's attracting all the capital flows. But if you move to this new transition, maybe countries can be rebuilt by using their own capital markets and lending to their own governments and actually investing in their own people. And then maybe people will want to go to their own countries, and they only left in the first place because the proof of weapons network created covert regime changes, death, destruction, overthrow of democracies, and replacing it with dictators, as we've always covered anyway. But they want an increase on defense spending. So we know what that means. You know, this is the corruption of those that control the Trump administration that want that money to go back to Israel so that the old model and America can be sacrificed in order to make sure that you and Americans get in another forever war with Iran while the European Union continue the forever war against Russia to sacrifice all the people in between, while, you know, those controllers decide who's going to get the gas, who's going to get the oil, and the AI race continues as well. It also includes, as I said, additional funding for border enforcement, another $1 billion of budget as well. So that's a good thing. And the only person on the Republican side that is also exposing the system, Thomas Massie, he voted no, so he got an attack from the Trump administration, and it is just being exposed that while we're being told that America has freedom of speech, they're going against the First Amendment, the Second Amendment. They're arresting people for, protesting against the wars and what's happening in Gaza at the moment. The files are not being released because they implicate Mossad. Anyone that speaks up against this is being weaponized even on the right side. And anyone, the old war machine, corrupt war machine, the neocons on the left, they're being made as if they're the war people, and the right people are not the war people. As I said, it's all the same thing. And that distracts people because it's not acting in America's best interest as well. Okay. what else have I got for you on the macro side? As I said, the goal here, as I see it at the moment, is to push down interest rates. That's the main goal. And if it requires, a temporary economic craziness through tariff wars, and a government shutdown in order to achieve it, that's one way to get it. And then a return to the old model as well, with everyone cheering it along, saying we're winning. As I said, I've always covered the key is you've got to be, if the rich are going to get richer and the poor are going to get poorer under this model, then you need to be accumulating the assets. You need to be boycotting debt, because that's the grease of the engine. You need to be saving in assets which are designed over the long term, not financial advice, to beat the system, which was Bitcoin. And then you essentially, by owning more Bitcoin this month than the previous month, you get to long-term escape the system. And by owning it in self-custody, you get to boycott the system. And then you can have more control over your monetary flows and have a resistance movement against it, while everything maybe get involved in politics to get out the corruption, and do the reforms that are needed. So Congress are doing what they are paid to do. When you follow the money, they're doing exactly what they're meant to do. Trump and the administration is not saving the average American. It's just a different corporate raiding and asset stripping strategy, handing over the EU war machine, while the US and China transition to technocracy. And the billionaires that are creating the technology, they were all sat around Trump, because they're the ones that are receiving all the money as a result of this asset stripping, and they're getting to benefit from it. While the rest of the world figures out how to build the resources, and those resources can be recollaborated into decentralized, open source, artificial intelligence as a resistance, social networks as a resistance, and Bitcoin as a resistance as well. And that's kind of where I think the map of the world is going right now. And that's where, so this week was about shrinking the stock market in order to try and get rates down. The Zelensky theater, which I covered last week, was all about increasing NATO budget from Europe, while making sure that chunks of that the war machine in Europe keeps Europe strong enough, but under the control of the expensive natural gas, so that Trump and America can control Europe through controlling those exports. Something went wrong, which is that they tried to weaken Russia, but then it aligned itself with BRICS. And so tariff wars are recollaborating, where America's, kind of looking at who's our enemies. And are we working with Mexico? Are we working with Canada? Are we working with Europe? Are we working with Panama? Are we working with Greenland? And then we move to reciprocal tariffs on April the 2nd, which is part of this painful part that people need to get to. While essentially the deep state, is it going to be exported or is it not? Is it going to be exposed or is it not? As I said, that's why the Epstein files need to show the truth. The Mossad element, not just the CIA element, and the JFK files and the 9/11 files, and all those different files, because then you can have an internal resistance based upon truth, and you got the Bitcoin strategic reserves and stable coins and tools to actually transition to a better world as well. So this transition requires fighting with allies, whether it's Europe, Mexico, Canada, South America, Central America, and it requires a battle with the petrodollar and the eurodollar. And the profits of the deep state want to maintain the eurodollar, maintain the petrodollar, and that's what the Ukraine-Russia war is really about. And that's what Israel and Palestine is really about, because Israel is no longer working in what it was designed to originally do. unless, of course, it is designed to make sure America is rinsed and asset stripped like Britain was by the Bank of England pre-World War One. Okay, so Canada on that side entered into the US-Canada trade war. That was the theatrics of this week. That was an escalation between Canada and America. That required a regime change. And so we went from the woke left narrative of Trudeau over to occupation of Canada by central banking, Bank of England, Bank of Canada, deep state agent, Mark Carney. And Mark Carney is the tough guy that's going to come along and make the change that is needed in order to stand up against Trump and execute this transition of the central banking proof of weapons network. So now they're not even hiding it. There is full occupation by central bankers in Canadian fiscal policy, not just monetary policy. So this means in case Canada doesn't give the central bank digital currency to the Central Bank of Canada, we can have a central banker that issues a technocratic stable coin, and we can make sure that the banks get that. And either way, we're funding both sides of the war throughout this transition, and they can hedge their bets. So they installed and implanted a regime change. Trudeau is over. Mark Carney is now the new head of Canada. And he's saying all the right things. What is he saying? Canada will never be the 51st state of America. And Trump's coming out and saying that counters that it's going to be, you are going to be the 51st state of America, rallying up the troops, creating these internal distractions and, making people think that this is all done in the name of patriotism. And the tariffs will disappear, he said. Trump said the tariffs will disappear if Canada joins the US as the 51st state of America. And so the US hikes tariffs on the Canadian steel and aluminium to 50%. And then Canada says, we're going to retaliate. And now you've got Mark Carney fighting Trump, executing the globalist agenda in these regime changes of fake democracies. And Trump demands that Canada drop it's, what is it said, 250% to 390% tariffs that Canada has on US duty, calling these outrageous in order to rile up the MAGA, in order to say, you've been treating us so badly. We're going to be treated better. Go Trump, get the tariffs out there, while they execute the vision. And the cults are getting stronger and stronger in this extreme popularism. The Democrats are getting further and further away, saying, look, he's crashing the economy. You see? And all of this different theatrics is happening. And Canada then comes out and said, we are going to sell all of our US dollar bonds. And immediately we're going to, we're no longer going to buy those bonds. And then you get the exact thing that was wanted in the first place, a strengthening of the Canadian dollar, potentially if they sell them relative to the US dollar, or a pivot from the strategy, because this was just about renegotiating assets, creating, stripping those assets, fooling people into selling all of their assets, while the proof of weapons recollaborates on the other side of what it's actually going to look like. Remember, all of these wars are central banking wars. This is the hostile takeover and the regime change that is needed through these open border policies. So why do these open borders exist? So that you can immediately rile up the emotion of the people. You can change at a whim. And these, it's just a mechanism of deciding, do we want to be in civil war or not? Well, is there more assets to strip, or do we want to calm that down while all the rich end up in stable jurisdictions like Dubai and Singapore, or islands like I moved to get away from the GBP proof of weapons network? Anyway, So Mark Carney is actually going to be a better fight. So we haven't got the woke left tools of Trudeau. We've now got the financial weapons of mass destruction that Mark Carney is used to firing when he was installed into the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada. So in the end of the war, Trump came back and said, after they're saying that they're going to sell bonds, Trump threatened to double tariffs on imports of all steel and aluminium from Canada, but immediately decided to scrap his decision after Canada then came back and agreed to roll back a 25% surcharge that was levied as another financial weapon on electricity exports to US. And so the energy wars, the arms race, the recollaboration, the recognition that artificial intelligence is going to power is no longer troops. And all of this has been exerted for on April the 2nd. We have our reciprocal tariffs. We enter into less volatility. And the model is known. Who's going to be at war with who? Who's going to be providing all energy? And of course, the European Commission announced that they're going to impose counter tariffs of, I think it said $26 billion euros, which is about $28 billion worth of US goods starting from next month. And so they're going to be imposing their tariffs. Then it moves to reciprocal, and you have to change the narratives to keep the war machine going, but change the euro dollar now that we have just this complete centralization and control of the major markets, and no concept of free markets, of free trade, of capitalism, just complete crony capitalism. And every day China's looking more and more like America, and America's looking more and more like China. And then they just meet in the middle with a stablecoin technocratic version or a central bank digital currency authoritarian version of the same model. So that was European Commission. They came out in their tariff war, and they said that this was in retaliation to Trump levying a 25% tariff on steel and aluminium, or aluminum, as you say in America, if you're watching from America. And this is what triggered the correction in the market. It led to a Bitcoin correction as well, and kind of hid the news that we covered, the very, very big news that we covered in This Week in Bitcoin. If you didn't watch that, go back to the This Week in Bitcoin. Hidden in that market correction was some really big news for those of you that have the longer term vision as well. So the S&P 500, it fell in one day. It's the lowest amount since September. I think it lost $1.7 trillion that was wiped out from the US stock market in one day. And over the 30 days of the Trump administration, wiped out $5.5 trillion in 30 days. Okay. And this is to exert the rotation that we are currently seeing into non-US dollar denominated capital markets, and to strengthen the non-US fiat currency proof of weapons networks, ready for probably the centralization pivot, either from the Fed or the administration. Part of that strategy is to combat some of the inflation by getting the price of oil down. And we know that oil is controlled by Saudi Arabia. And so at the center of all these negotiations that we'll cover in the geopolitical section is Mohammed bin Salman and the UAE networks and the GCC and those with Russia, OPEC plus. And they're able to decide how many barrels of oil are we going to put out there to decide whether to crash a system or not, depending on the negotiations. So oil corrected down to $65 per barrel. Trump and the Trump administration has publicly stated that they want it down to $50 per barrel in order to combat inflation now that we've got the lower than expected CPI. When you can get the Federal Reserve to reduce the rates so that they can roll over all of the debt and print significantly more money when it goes to the other model. So OPEC Plus and Russia, they came out and they announced essentially that they are ready to cut production against Trump's wishes. And that is leverage for the negotiations, which ties into the geopolitical wars as well, and those negotiations. These are essentially negotiation tactics. This is when everyone meets in Saudi Arabia, which the meetings have already started. If they do get to this $50 per barrel, it will be a massive hit for the US oil producers, and OPEC Plus can sustain it, but I don't think they want it to go that low. And so those are the negotiations, and that's what will be determine the outcome of these things. But if we do move into a recession, that will create chaos on the natural gas market, and that will just wreak havoc everywhere as well. So these are the things that we need to see. Now, remember, Trump is a real estate guy, so he also benefits from the lower rates. And the real estate market, it is looking for lower rates in order to open up the credit markets, which is where the bank gets to create more dollars and use the Federal Reserve in order to basically print more money backed by real estate. And then Trump gets to do more deals, and those that from the bank lobby get whatever they wanted as well when they bought the administration. So I believe all of this recession talks, all of these tariff wars, this is the strategy to make the Fed way more likely to cut rates, and you expect a rate cutting environment, whereas before the Fed wasn't necessarily there. Some couple of other things as well worth following. The Financial Times reports that many European governments are feeling buyer's remorse for decades and decades of US arm purchases that have left them dependent upon Washington. And so that is about right. We need to, Europe, take up the reins. We have to keep the narrative that Trump is Hitler, and we need to start doing the Ukrainian flag thing and kill more Ukrainians is a sad tragedy of this whole thing because they don't have enough soldiers and the economics don't work. We've covered that in previous episodes as well. So the German defense giants, sorry, I'll try and practice my German. Rheinmetall basically came out and says that in order to facilitate this, we could take over the stock of the corporate raided Volkswagen, which was hugely, a part of everything that happened during World War II as well for the military industrial complex. And so we can take away manufacturing cars and we can take over those plants and we can use them in order to produce tanks. And what happened last week? And in this, the price crashed so that you can asset strip it and use the productive economy for the European proof of weapons network. And you can get the ECB to print off more and more so that they can now have a wartime economic stimulus, and the market lapped it up and enjoyed it as we had this repatriation of capital out of America into the European Union war machine. That's what central banks do. That's why they were created in the first place. And no, they're not there in order to, support a stability in the markets. They are there for pump and dumps, to fund wars and get governments into debt, asset strip it, and move on to the next pump and dump Ponzi scheme over a multi-decade strategy and wipe out the middle class, quite frankly. In terms of summer flows as well, we need to watch what's happening in Syria, and this will lead to the geopolitical section as well, because for the very first time since the fall of the Assad regime within Syria, there was a Russian tanker with about 30,000 tons of fuel arrived in Syria, and that was following an agreement between Damascus and Moscow. And so the new regime is doing deals with Moscow while America occupies all the oil. And so the fact that these flows are allowing to happen might help us explain in the geopolitical section why violence uprised within Syria, and why our media, depending on where you were, based upon the funding of the military-industrial complex, intelligence, and lobby, was giving a different story to push a different narrative as well. And that was being perpetuated through all the paid influencers on X to push the narrative that was right for the regime change that they're actually looking for. So Iran used to supply Syria with approximately 3 million barrels a month. And now that is happening from Moscow, and those deals are being constructed. And so that kind of implies that the violence in Syria was an Israel first policy, and NATO through Turkey were aligned. And that explains all of the massacres and the narratives that you're about to be false flagged into to make you think something different is happening to what is actually happening. And so a supply that stopped after Damascus, what is the future of the Iran relationship? Well, that's why Israel is occupying more and more territory right now. And that's why you're getting a narrative of the tribes that were funded by Mossad, like ISIS, the funders that were the tribes that were funded by the CIA, like Al-Qaeda. You're starting to get that narrative in order to say, Muslims are killing Christians, was the narrative you were getting there. And so I'm going to dig deeper into that, but the monetary flows allow you to predate that because there's something going on between the relationship with Syria, Israel, Turkey, Russia, Iran, America, Qatar, UK, and that brings us into the geopolitical section. So that's going to do it for everything on This Week in Macro, or Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 74. Please do me a favor. If you enjoyed this, please head over to YouTube. If you're not a subscriber, if everyone that is watching this subscribed, hit the bell symbol, hit all, then it will help me get to 100,000 subscribers so I can get unshadow banned, get a blue check mark, and get a review for my content. Now, half the stuff I talk about that was censored before is now actually happening and being revealed through some of these file drops. So please do me a favor. I'm going to get myself a little bit of water. We're going to move into part 3, where we cover this week in geopolitics. And we need to understand more in Syria so that we can understand what's going to happen in the Bitcoin and macro side as we cover future episodes and we transition to this world of Bitcoin, AI, and CBDCs. So hit the like button, hit the reshare, hit the subscribe button, put a comment below, and we're going to cover part 3, This Week in Geopolitics. Okay, welcome to Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 74, part 3, This Week in Geopolitics. We covered what is happening in the Middle East with many of the Bitcoin trends. We also covered why there was a big shift in the macroeconomic environment towards focusing on what's happening in Syria, and why meetings are happening in Saudi Arabia in order to renegotiate the future of the petrodollar and the euro dollar. And the flows of oil resources and the AI races and the companies that are being sacrificed in order to pump the EU war machine. Now we're going to go into the geopolitics of everything we saw this week. This is where we get a bit more humanitarian based upon the money flows, and we realize the sheer cost, devastation, destruction, immorality, and the just absolute disgust of the occupation by central banks when they constructed this proof of weapons network. Now we get a bit more humanitarian. So depending on what network was funding your media, you were told a different story. You were either told nothing's going on in Syria, or you were told that Iran is creating havoc in Syria, or you were told that Muslims are killing Christians. It all depends on which part of the proof of weapons network fake media you were watching, and whether you're on X following people that are implementing regime changes by trying to get all of the influencers that are funding to spread the particular narrative that meets the agenda when we follow the money. So depending on that, let me tell you what I saw anyway. So there was Syrian violence, massacres, death, destruction, and the reality of the situation is that Syria is a playground for outside interest. It has America occupying the oil and the wheat. It has Israel occupying the Golan Heights and strategic locations that are needed in order to push America into a war with Iran and be able to control some of the resistances in Lebanon while it commits ethnic cleansing and genocide in Gaza and the West Bank. Turkey is controlling parts of it through the funding of the new government, HTS. And in order to create resistance against the US controlled part, which is the Kurds occupying the oil. The Kurds are a leftist, Marxist, communist ideology that wants to create its own Kurdish state. But Turkey would be economic destruction because it takes part of Iran, parts of Syria, parts of Turkey, and it would have a significant impact. Plus, Turkey is holding millions of the refugees that were the victims of the proof of weapon network when Israel and America weaponized ISIS, and Iran was pushing back with the resistance in Lebanon with Hezbollah in order to fight against ISIS. And then you had the different proxies and all these different groups, which are now been rebranded as the government of Syria. And I'm not saying that the genuine people that were part of these rebel groups are actually trying to fight against the oppression of the Assad regime that had definitely MI6 chemical weapons installed into the regime and repackaged in order to take down Assad. But at the same time, he was committing atrocities because the sanctions meant that you had more and more corruption and more atrocity that was being done. And it's a mess of confusion designed to destabilize in the region, entering it into a civil war and just killing more people, so that when Israel wants to say it's the crazy Islamists killing each other, you can take Hezbollah fighting against ISIS. ISIS is a proxy of Israel weaponized through America. And then you get to tell out the narrative. See, these crazy Muslims, they want to kill all the Jews. And then you can say, oh, that's what the Palestinians were doing when you allow atrocity propaganda on October the 7th to happen. When you say, oh, it was all these mass rapes. And then Israel enables the Hannibal Directive, which led to the killing of their own people. And then you say it was them. And then whenever the bodies are returned because Israel is just annihilating Gaza, you can say those people were strangled by the thugs and the terrorists in order to weaponize the network of those that are allied with the Zionist vision that also have very significant control over media and lobby groups in order to completely control the narrative and take people like Elon Musk and make sure they never tell the truth. And they're simply executing a vision for the deep state, for the lobby. And this is exactly what these things are. A mountain of confusion, lies, death, deception, and quite frankly, crimes against humanity. So America, Israel, Turkey, Qatar, they repackaged ISIS and Al-Qaeda and said, here's the new boss. We'll give them all of the weapons. They weaponized to take out the Assad regime. And now we call them HTS. And we tell used to be the head chopper that used to be in the videos to try and weaponize against Muslims. Now he wears a suit. And then the United Nations leadership, they legitimize it. And Europe comes along and says, we recognize. And then they say, America, please take down the sanctions to legitimize it. And now the head chopper is suddenly in charge. And the genuine resistance of people that want to take back, control after oppression, they believe that they're actually getting their resistance, but this is just control of their government. And then you get the real, regimes happening where once they're in power, They do the old techniques, and they just commit absolute atrocities and crimes against humanity. So while the ISIS and Al Qaeda and the rebels are being funded, armed, provided intelligence in order to achieve it, they overthrow the Assad regime. Then you create the carnage of Russia has its strategic interest in Tartus. Then you have Iran that has its ability to get weapons to Hezbollah that were fighting ISIS, and were then making sure that Israel doesn't do October the 7th and take out Gaza and take out the West Bank and cause an uprising. You get to dismantle that. And that's exactly what we're seeing. So that creates absolute carnage. And now Syria is just an absolute battleground again for all the different foreign interests, because it just happens to be its location, its neighbors with Israel, its ability to have strategic ports into the Mediterranean, and it overlooks strategic elements of Lebanon and Iran that Israel wants to occupy. And it has oil and wheat so that Israel can get American troops there, so it can use false flag operations to justify its goal of getting America into another forever war as well, based upon the narratives. So this week, anyway, tragically, it completely exposed what happens when you leave these people in charge. Basically, there was death. Over 1,000 civilians. If you watch the same videos that I was watching, disgusting. And then the media just says, oh, those are the people that we want them to be. And those are the people that we want them to be. And you get to use it all for narrative. It's like death porn in order to perpetuate media and propaganda inflicted by intelligence agencies in order to weaponize religion to create all of this divide and conquer. As a result of all of these psyops that are being played. So one of the narratives was that the Muslims are killing the Christians. And they said, yeah, they're just massacring the Christians. Narrative is, look, none of this is about religion, just so you know. So if you see the influencers that either they bought into the narrative like Tucker Carlson, or they are controlled opposition to push out the network, because you see the large influencers on X that suddenly say the Christians are being massacred by the Muslims. The Zionists love that because that's a narrative that they want. They get the power structure that they want in order to expand and take over more territory. And then you get to use the Tucker Carlson network, the influencer network, the Jordan Peterson network, the Andrew Tate network, where you get both sides of the Christian Muslim atrocity propaganda, and you get to do that to confuse everybody about what's actually really happening, because no one understands it as well. And it's all foreign governments, and it's all external control. Okay, so as I see it, Hezbollah were the real resistance against ISIS, and that was then weaponized because Iran was funding Hezbollah, which was a resistance against Israel in Lebanon. They moved from Lebanon over to Syria to fight ISIS, because ISIS is Israel and America weaponized. And so they're fighting each other, but Iran was funding Hezbollah. And when they were fighting against ISIS, you get to say Muslim versus Muslim, and then they get to say this is Shia versus Sunni and create divide and conquer sectarianism. And through war of killing children and various other things, you get to radicalize these people, which is exactly what the intelligence agencies want. So when Hezbollah are now, because they're funded by Iran, and they needed to defend the Assad regime, you ended up with atrocities, and then they say this is sectarianism because people were killed as a result of this. And that's how you create a complete psyop and cocktail mess that leads to this stuff. And Russia and Iran have their strategic interests, and US has their strategic interests. and Israel is used, and Israel has different interests as well. The last Trump administration actually killed the person that was taking on ISIS. He was known as the ISIS Slayer. That was Qasem Soleimani. Sorry. Trump actually executed that and said that he was the one that took down ISIS when he actually wiped out the person that was taking on ISIS that would have led to peace and not a civil war in the Middle East. But Trump was delivered through intelligence from Mossad in order to take that out as well. And he talks about it very proud at the moment. But what happened from that? Trump takes credit for wiping out ISIS. ISIS and CIA, they're just ISIS and Al Qaeda are rebranded as HTS. And then Turkey through NATO is used in order to train them up through America, through Israel, through Turkey. Qatar then pushes out a different narrative to the pro-Palestinian people as well, because they own Al Jazeera. And then you get to blame Iran, and then you have all this cocktail and this mess, depending on what media you're actually following as well. So Trump takes credit for it. ISIS rebrands them. America prints the money. The Fed does it. America middle class gets wiped out. US aid is used in order to control the media. And then the media pays all of the Congress people. The Congress people perpetuate the narrative. You have regime change across the Western people with like Keir Starmer and various other things. And they push out that it is the Jewish people or the Muslim people. And they're sat back saying, what the hell is going on? And really, it's just a deep state working for the military-industrial complex to push profits of the proof of weapons network in order to push that. Now, remember, we got the dismantling of the petrodollar by exposing the USAID and National Endowment of Democracy through Doge. And it revealed that there was 697 million in 2024 that was used in order to fund training camps of ISIS, Taliban, and Al Qaeda. So look, we know that. It was all released on WikiLeaks anyway. I've covered it multiple times. It's the reason why I'm shadow banned, because I help people understand that. But who was actually getting massacred for real? Well, it was actually the Alawite civilians and many other ethnic minorities in order to ensure that none of those civilians are basically just being weaponized to create atrocity propaganda so that there is no power within Syria, because now Israel occupies a massive chunk of it and it wants to make sure that no one rises up. And that's why it wiped out all of the military to ensure that their installed government doesn't have any type of power. And then they can create the sectarian divides and all the different divides, and they're willing to kill people to make it happen. This is what props up the fiat currency proof of weapons network. And you're seeing it more now than ever. So I covered the massive propaganda attempts that were put out there to divert attention and confuse people. The Western media was reported that it's the Christians being massacred by the Islamists. Qatar, who does very good in actually through Al Jazeera covering the Gazan genocide, but because it backs the overthrow of the Assad regime, it was making it out like this is all Iran-backed militia. And so Al Jazeera was completely changing the story. And they basically called the killers ex-Assad loyalists. And that's to play to, that segment of people that need to hear that message. And then they're reported as they are Iran proxies that created this. Iran probably wants to return some of its power. So there's an element of truth to it. But the media just basically says, let's take all of these videos, all of these massacres, and let's just say that was you, and we can push out the narrative as well. Again, the government was sponsored to take out the Assad regime by the US, the UK, Israel, Qatar, Turkey, and it was regime change. And the government was led by Gilani, and Gilani is ex-ISIS and Al-Qaeda, used to chop off heads, now wears a suit. He's been selected by Mossad, MI6, and the CIA, and his job was to execute a regime change. And then once you have this type of person, you can push out the doom porn and the atrocity propaganda in order to weaken the religion, and then it can be used for the interest groups that those that are funding and paying the bills are doing. Just to help you understand, HTS, which is the current Syrian government that is signing joint deals to partner with the Kurds, which is the US proxies. They used to have a 10 million reward on them. Turkey considers them terrorists. America considers them terrorists. You rebrand them, put suits on them. But Turkey is basically in bed with the ex-ISIS Al-Qaeda proxies, which is the leadership right now. And they are now aligned with Israel because they're allowing Israel to occupy more and more territory. You have the Druze militia, which are essentially backed by Israel as well. That's a different set there. The Kurds are backed by the US. There is a Port Tartus, which is backed by Russia. They have their own security there. Rather than doing it by proxy, they actually have Russians on the ground there. And Iran is essentially feeling a little bit of betrayed because it lost power in this whole thing. And it felt like Turkey did it. So the relationship between Iran and Turkey is a geopolitical playground at the moment. As the end result is that Israel gains power, and they're kind of semi-aligned with Turkey at the same time as saying that it would declare war with Israel because its population are pro-Palestinian, and they have their NATO membership, and you have this cocktail of mess as well. That can only be solved through diplomacy. But Israel need to make sure that war perpetuates forever so that no one coordinated group like the GCC can align with America, and then America can agree to stop defunding. And then the GCC can say, we need peace in the region, but Israel doesn't want that because it needs to get America into the war. And then America doesn't want that because it needs to focus on the AI race. And so there is that internal conflict because we know through following the money, almost all of the Congress is controlled by Israeli lobby, military industrial complex, banking lobby, and the crossovers of those monetary networks as well. It seems like Russia may, and it's very confusing as well, but when following the money, it may have favored Israel in this particular situation, security over its Iran influence within Syria. But BRICS is stronger than ever because of the relationship with China as well. So, this kind of tells you that it's always nuanced. It's not quite as straightforward, especially when you're dealing with complexity. Turkey definitely was the one that overthrew the Assad regime, and it's basically caused all the tensions with Iran. Iran and Turkey have these tensions. Iran does not kind of seem ready to give up Syria at the moment, so maybe there are some militias there. And remember, Syria has $300 billion of debt, if you're following the money, to Iran. Iran is going through that extensive sanction regime, which is drawing Iran closer to BRICS and closer to China. And so US is protecting Israel power so that it can target Iraq, which is its neighbor, and Iran from its occupied territories, which Israel is occupying, and creating just economic turmoil as well within Syria, which is leading to death and destruction as usual, and the rape and massacring of the resources and the oil and the wheat, which is causing the current government to not be able to have any type of power unless it signs an agreement with the Kurds, which is how you get a puppet government installed in Syria that can then become Israel first as well. So Israel's goal is to prevent any one power rising, which is why you got to have death and destruction to keep the proof of weapons network going. And so you need massacres to give the atrocity propaganda, which is exactly what Israel did on October the 7th. If you haven't watched the blog Atrocity Inc., it's on my blog, where it goes through exactly how atrocity propaganda was used in order to weaponize and create the war based upon the events of October 7th. So for the first time, Turkey and Israel seem to be that they share a common interest and a border. So that kind of reshapes the sphere of influence, within Syria. And you have Iran weakened so that it can move into what Trump is doing, where he started to escalate the discussions with Iran. So we'll go through that and understand by following the money what the likely outcome is there. Turkey has been emboldened to become more of a regional power. That plays into North Africa and the rare earth minerals that are being used through its Rwandan and Ugandan security deals, Ethiopian security deals as well, to maintain getting those rare earth minerals out to the West, that is funding the militia groups like M23 in Congo, that is killing more and more people to steal all of Congo's, the largest amount of rare earth minerals, and hand them over to Rwanda as a shell country for Western interest. And then you have, ISIS invasions in certain regions, so that then Trump can fire rockets and bomb in Somalia to pretend that it's fighting terrorism, when it just takes more and more resources as well. Anyway, we've covered that in many, many different videos as well. So US is consolidating its occupation with the Kurds. Syria has been transformed into basically a patchwork of different zones of influence, controlled by completely external powers. And depending on how the negotiations happens, you get all these massacres in between. And we have to all fall for it by paying influencers to push out propaganda and media. Okay. So that's the situation. It's a complete cocktail of mess within Syria. But what was the purpose of that? Well, there was an announcement this week that SDF, which represents the Syrian government, ex-ISIS Al-Qaeda, they signed a strategic partnership with the Kurds. And that is an agreement which is American puppet government. That's the end result of that. So they can open up the oil and wheat at the right time, depending on exactly how it goes, as Israel takes more and more land and occupies and then commits to the Greater Israel project as well. There's a few more parts of it. So this week in the Lebanese side, we saw that Israel carried out 24 airstrikes on Lebanese territories. This is in violation of the ceasefire that was agreed in January. So we've now got approximately 227, I think it was last time I looked, recorded violations of the ceasefire agreement. But the US installed their proxy government, so the Western media doesn't cover any of this. And basically this is due to Lebanon has a US proxy government at the same time as Israel committing those atrocities, killing more people. And so therefore the Lebanese are not confronting Israel. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs filed a complaint with the United Nations Security Council. And of course, US gets to veto vote that unless Trump takes it out of United Nations. But it does the whole thing of utilizing United Nations. And whenever someone commits war crimes on their side, like Netanyahu, it just sanctions it and says, oh, it doesn't count. It only counts if you're using the veto vote to prevent a Palestinian self-determination. So there was a complaint detailed against Israel. It outlined all the violations that Israel is committing on Lebanese civilians. It continues to violate all of the ceasefire agreements. There is ongoing land and air attacks from Israel into Lebanon. It is actually destroying and taking out more homes, more residential people's homes, taking out residential neighborhoods, more civilian casualties. It's abducted Lebanese civilians in the complaint as well. This was including Lebanese army soldiers as well. It is attacks on civilians that are returning to their border villages as well. That was in the complaint. The death of approximately 24 civilians this week, and injuries to more than 125 others through these operations. And now, at the moment, we are now 13 days, 13 days into Israel's starvation campaign, where Israel has basically just occupied the borders, stopped going into the phase 2 negotiations, ignored the peace agreements that are needed and were being negotiated, required America to come out and try and do it. And in the whole time, on the 1st of March, for Ramadan, the Palestinians and the Gazans are in 13 days into a starvation campaign, where they are essentially weaponizing. No aid can come through. America's still making sure that Egypt is bribed in order to hold that border with Israel. No water can get through, so they're making sure that there's no clean water. No energy can get through. There's no food that is allowed to get through. No tents and shelter is allowed to get through. No mobile homes are allowed to get through. This was all in the peace agreement. And then they've wiped out electricity, so they don't have electricity to be able to communicate, to upload videos into Telegram. The French Proof of Weapons Network tried to take out Telegram as well to make sure that European Union was used, so we don't get freedom of speech, because those videos were getting out to X, and then Israel had to infiltrate Elon in order to make sure that we get freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach. And freedom of reach is the paid agents with the millions of followers to perpetuate whatever narrative is in the interest as well. So just so you know, aid is completely under international law, under the, if you have an occupation, you have to provide this. This came from the laws that were set up during the Holocaust. And America is just completely wiping it out, ignoring it, pretending it's not there, and just taking away the order. And then Trump is basically saying, we're going to sanction the court. We're going to sanction anyone that tries to bring up these cases like South Africa. So that tells you a lot when you put all this together about who is running the EU Proof of Weapons Network and the US Dollar Proof of Weapons Network as well. Right. So at the same time, the GCC, remember I told you they came out with their plan. There was a $53 billion plan that said we will have a security deal with America. The GCC, the Gulf nations, will ensure a two-state solution. They'll invest $53 billion into rebuilding Gaza. They'll put together a plan of letting all the aid in. And America, all they need to do is stop funding Israel to stop that from happening, to stop peace from happening, stop using their security United Nations vote to veto vote everything. And Egypt, basically, they could go for the plan. And then we can have the rebuilding and the new system. But as soon as the peace plan, which is completely feasible by the GCC, Israel and US rejected Egypt and GCC two-state solution. They said instead that they wanted to do their plan of Israel ensuring that ethnic cleansing happens, they return to genocide, and the war continues. And so France, Germany, UK, and the Islamic organization, they came out and backed the Egypt and GCC plan, but only America and Israel unbacked the plan. Trump and Netanyahu, they basically said that they're sticking to occupation. They're sticking to ethnic cleansing. They want to bribe Jordan and Egypt in order to expand the war, which is Israel's plan, by just expanding the borders and sending the resistance over to Egypt and Jordan, so then they can get the Greater Israel Project, they can get America in, and they can get war with Iran as well. Trump says that, we had a pivot as well. So if you watch this week in the White House, meanwhile, back in the propaganda from CNN and BBC and Fox News side of the world, Trump said that no one will be expelled from the Gaza Strip. So there was a walk back. Why was there a walk back? Because Trump walked it back because he was sitting next to the Irish Prime Minister, and the Irish Prime Minister have joined the genocide case against Israel. They've been in United Nations ensuring that the illegal occupation, they've been standing up for Palestinian rights. And so Trump had to change its narrative because the proof of weapons network between America and Ireland requires much of the globalist tax havens like Apple. He focused on Big Pharma, but the big tech companies, he didn't mention big tech, he just mentioned Big Pharma, because big tech is the transition. They're the beneficiaries. They're the ones that paid for Trump to pay president. But because of that, the Irish Prime Minister was there, and now he suddenly says, "Oh right, no, we're not going to be doing ethnic cleansing of Gaza. They will be staying where they are." So, I told you not to take that seriously. It was a waste of breath. I told you why. The environment just does not do it, because the reality is that the resistance is still there. We see it every weekend during the hostage swaps. And we even had US directly negotiating with Hamas. So this was all about Israel using propaganda to kill the Palestinians, as we've always said. Because they're not achieving any of their goals. And so if US ever occupied, that would create the resistance. That's what Israel wants. And then they could use false flag operations to get America into war with Iran. I'll go through why that doesn't work, but it only works for Israel. And it could take us to World 3 based upon everything that happened this week as well. So this week we had the Witkoff negotiations. This is Steve Witkoff from the Trump administration. And he's now doing a 50-day ceasefire negotiation in exchange for half of the remaining hostages and a promise to do phase 2. And so this is just a renegotiation. They're not sticking to the ceasefire agreement. And the problem is that the reason that they're not doing that is because Hamas have already agreed to step aside and allow new leadership to step in. But they said they've already agreed to return all of the hostages in phase 2 and 3. But they said you have to do Palestinian self-determination. And that's the biggest problem for Israel because they want to exterminate and continue and get back to the war because that is what the Israeli government are saying they want, and they've threatened to leave the government and overthrow the Israel government if they don't go back to war, which is why the protesters in Israel are saying, we know that the Israeli government doesn't want to release the hostages. And in fact, when they have bombarded and killed our own people, they're using propaganda to say it's Hamas strangling them. And the families are coming out and saying, no, that's not true. And then Israel is suppressing that. And you're just getting this absolute craziness within Israel at the moment as well. Now, there was a crazy off-script thing that happened this week. And immediately Israel had to eliminate the United States envoy for hostages. So he came on TV and it was said that US, before the war returns, they want to get their US hostages out because it would be political disaster, or they're negotiating this in order to say that actually the US is negotiating directly with Hamas and they didn't go through Israel in order to do that. So he came in and said, we are negotiating with Hamas directly. This was all done, I believe, behind Israel's back. It was completely off script. He actually said things like, yeah, Hamas are just people like us, and they don't have horns growing out, and they are very willing to negotiate, and we think we can get all the hostages back, and we can actually get peace and we can actually get that. And he actually went on CNN and did an interview. And the interviewer at CNN, which is paid by the Israeli lobby, was horrified with the thought of peace. And this guy went completely off script and said the truth, that we could actually have ceasefire right away. We could have had that at any point as well. And so the US had meetings with Hamas. And he actually said they were very helpful. I quote, he said the meetings were very helpful. He said, I did not rule out additional meetings with Hamas in the future to negotiate with them. He also said, I believe that we can release all captives and not just the American ones by us just negotiating direct. He also said that a deal regarding a ceasefire in Gaza and the captives all being returned may be happening and could happen within the coming weeks. So he literally came out and said the truth off script. Israeli government freaked out, activated the proof of weapons network, fully used its media control to say, no more interviews. You can't talk about that. Israel was not happy at all. Basically, it was leaked that he was fired. And so the US hostage negotiator, just like whenever there was ever going to be peace, Israel just assassinated the leadership so that peace doesn't happen. They basically used their proof of weapons network and their Israeli lobby to fire people from the Trump administration. And so that was taken out. Today, we got news that Hamas has actually agreed to release 1 US hostages and the 3 bodies that they claim were killed by Israel through the bombardments as well. So that was actually announced today because this person went direct and immediately he gets fired. I'm not sure if the firing is true, but it was leaked. And so you can look into that as well. Now, the current situation where we stand right now, Hamas has agreed to step aside a new leadership. It is agreed to release all of the hostages in full. And the Israeli government doesn't want you to know that this is possible. So Trump is being used in order to say really, really bad things to push the Israeli narrative. Israeli protesters all know this, so they're coming out on TV, but it's not making its way to the West and saying, we don't believe our government wants to release the hostages and send them home. And the Israeli war cabinet is going to be meeting tomorrow to react to this disaster that it was leaked that peace can totally be achieved. And so now they're going to give an answer to this and that the fact that the US went out without Israel. And so we'll see what they say tomorrow, and we'll cover it next week in the geopolitical section. All this to say, peace is totally possible. And there's only one thing that needs to happen. US just needs to force Israel to accept the Egypt GCC deal and that plan, and everything can move forward. There's only one side that is blocking that right now and doesn't want a 2-state solution and wants to get back to war, and that is the Israeli government. So what happened in order to combat against this? Okay, in the United Nations this week, Israel actually got accused of genocidal acts. The United Nations report was released, and the United Nations says that Israel has systemically targeted women's healthcare facilities in Gaza and has been using sexual violence as a war strategy during the conflict. So everything they said on October the 7th, Hamas were doing, every accusation is a confession, and now the United Nations has released the report. And predictably, what does Israel say? It says the United Nations report is anti-Semitic. Okay, so there's that whole thing. So we've got the ICC, the highest court, is anti-Semitic. We've got the ICJ that has the plausible genocide case, is anti-Semitic. Requesting an end to the illegal occupation is anti-Semitic. Every single country in the world that is voting and being veto voted by America for Palestinian self-determination is anti-Semitic. The United Nations report and evidence of everything happening is anti-Semitic. What happens at the moment? Trump is basically grooming, and all of the pro-Zionist Congress of the Trump administration is grooming Americans as hard as they can around why they need to go to war with Iran for Israel. So we got massive amounts of narrative control around that. Trump suddenly announced during this that is now moving to maximum pressure campaign in order to get Iran oil exports to zero. And so the Proof of Weapon Network has created this network. BRICS has gone through for creating a network across China. The different corridors are being built across BRICS with India, China, Iran, and various other regions, and Russia. And now Trump is coming out and saying, right, we need the campaign to get all those oils to zero. It wants to economically destroy because even though Iran basically has a 25-year energy agreement with China, and it won't be affected by this. And Trump basically sent out a letter to Iran after pushing that narrative that he wants to enter into a negotiation of a nuclear deal. The Zionist-controlled Congress really don't want that to happen because there's the neocon element, there's the Zionist element, and that's the last thing. I actually believe that Trump wants a deal and wants to do that because it makes total economic sense. But he's got the Zionist element that doesn't want a deal and won't allow for a deal, and that's why Trump tore it up previously in his administration. So because of all of this, because they've been back and forth with Obama, they've been back and forth with Clinton, they've been back and forth with Bush, they've been back and forth with Trump, they were back and forth with Biden, and now they're back and forth with the same old tricks after decades of experience. They just don't believe that they want to negotiate because they know it was always about buying time while you escalate militarily, and then Israel uses its network to undo the deal, and then no one can get in charge unless they undo the deal, which is what Trump did last time. So that's why Trump tore up the deal for Israel last time. Iran will only allow for negotiations if sanctions are actually lifted. So the letter that Trump said to Iran, it basically had no concessions. It didn't have any removal of the sanctions. So it was basically saying, let's negotiate a nuclear deal, but we're not giving you anything. Just stop nukes. Just stop refining uranium. And so Iran obviously came out and said, well, are you going to give us anything? Is this a negotiation? And then Trump pushed the narrative across the media. He said, he went out on Truth Social. He said, if Iran doesn't agree to a nuclear deal soon, America may have to go in militarily. This is what Israel wants to hear. He's testing it. Will America allow it? Will MAGA support it? No, you need more and more atrocity propaganda in order to do that. So then suddenly all of the Muslims are killing Christians was activated, and the Syrian side was activated in order to go more and more aggressive on this negotiation. Iran came out and rejected Trump's request for nuclear talks. And then Tucker Carlson was initiated in order to a interview with the head of Qatar, which was very, very interesting if you didn't watch it as well. So he did an interview and he helped understand why war with Iran is just absolutely not possible. So the Qatar leader said that targeting Iran's nuclear plants, which is what Israel wants America to do, it will actually destroy all of the water, because Qatar is neighbors with Iran and there is a nuclear refinery plant right on the border next to the water. And so that would contaminate all of the water into Qatar, all of the water into UAE, all of the fish that Qatar and UAE rely on. And so you can't actually do this. So Abraham Accords can't happen. So this is, it just helps you understand that this is all just about sabotaging everything so that Israel can become the regional power with its illegal nukes that aren't following any of the agreements that it stole from America after Mossad assassinated JFK, and then we don't get those files. And then what did JFK do? He wanted to stop AIPAC bribing the government by registering them as a foreign agent. And then he also did a monetary reform where he said an executive order started issuing treasury dollars backed by silver, which takes away the proof of weapons network and the Fed. And so he got wiped out. And now we're promised that those files will come out, and then they don't come out. Why? Because they're being released by Zionists that are there acting as Israel first in the pretense of America first. Qatar and UAE, they actually are strategic assets of America. They have their US bases. They aligned. They did their normalization. Qatar even had said in the interview that they have a Hamas office. And the Hamas office was put in place at the request of America so that they can do negotiations. But Israel doesn't want that to happen because, remember, Israel, via Qatar, funded Hamas because it wanted to fight against the US puppet government, the Palestinian Authority, that could have delivered peace through a two-state solution, which is why Jeffrey Epstein network was utilized in order to blackmail any leaders that could lead to peace and the Palestinian cause and sabotage Oslo Accords, which is what Clinton was used for, and why they're not releasing the Epstein list or the JFK list or the 9/11 list that actually has money that came from Witkoff lent to US urban movers that was actually a van that had the weapons in it that was arrested by the FBI and after a month disappeared and then went on Israeli media and said we were sent in order to film 9/11, and they were filming it and they were warning people. And Larry Silverstein, who took out the insurance before the towers came down, and then that bomb was used to take out the third where no plane went into it. And Larry Silverstein ended up getting $14 billion insurance check in the first ever deal, knowing that it was going to happen. And then urban movers had their Mossad agents to film it, and there was an infiltration with all the art students, and there was all of the intelligence that was being reported. This is all in the actual 9/11 files, but they're making sure that the Congress, which is controlled by Zionists, cannot tell that information to Israel, because then America might know that there's been complete infiltration, and then the American people and the MAGA people might demand, Israel, you're on your own. And if Israel is on your own, they'd have to accept peace with the GCC Egypt deal, and the Palestinians would have self-determination, and there would need to be an actual nuclear deal with Iran, and we'd actually have to move to peace. But Israel would just have to accept its current economic reality, and that's not what Israel wants. And that's why all these proxies exist, and all this violence and death and destruction exists, because it was the strategy that MI5 created, trained CIA on it after World War II, and then built out the Mossad proof of weapons network when the Rothschild network were taken because the Bank of England killed Britain, and the Bank of England needed World War One, and then it used World War One for Walt Rothschild to hand over hand over Palestine to Israel, and then an atrocity was needed in order to bring all the Jewish people over to Israel to join the IDF, to engage in ethnic cleansing on the belief that they need protecting, and then they weaponized anti-Semitism in order to control the network, build out the network. The Cold War led to all of this covert operations to protect the dollar, created the euro dollar, created the petrodollar, And then when the Cold War was over, you needed to create the fake war on terror. The fake war on terror needed something to weaponize Muslims, to play them off against Jewish people, as Israel was trying to get all the Jewish people over there so that they could weaponize that part of their religion. And the complete psyop happened. And 9/11 led to the clean break memo. Clean break memo led to the destruction of Syria, Sudan, Somalia, Iraq, Iran, funded both sides of those wars. Iran is the last one on the list, and Libya, because they wanted to create a gold-backed Pan-African currency that could use the resources across Africa. And Saddam Hussein wanted to price oil in euro and break the petrodollar. And therefore, it had to be eliminated, propped up the dollar. But now the model is no longer needed because America has its own resources. And BRICS was created, and China's winning by supporting all the countries that America destroyed. And now we're going back to this regional power, and we've had this new thing. America could win the AI race unless it's dragged into a forever war. Israel wants to drag America into a forever war, and Congress owns it. And that's the relationship that everyone needs to understand. That helps you understand all the different wars, all the different history, and what is happening behind the scenes, and why the Trump administration is currently exerting an Israel first policy as it hands over the assets, as was covered in the macro section, as it launches this technocracy as well. So just so you know, if America is persuaded to go to war with Iran, and then you wipe out Qatar and UAE by contaminating some of those nuclear refineries, that would create absolute carnage. It would wipe out the relationships of the region. Death, destruction, violence. America would be in a forever war, 1,000,000 times worse than Iraq. Iran has, advanced drones, was providing them with Russia, agreements with BRICS, is dependency for China's economy, strategically important. They need the chips that are manufactured in Taiwan. That would create the trillions of economic destruction just so that Israel could benefit using America as the pawn. Iran already it can retaliate. If you want to get the false flag going, Israel can target Iran. Iran will retaliate by targeting the US bases in Iraq and Syria, which is why they're put there. And that would create a issue with the Syria conflict because they're occupying the oil there. That could push up the price of oil. And then we could just repeat the same cycle that happened during the Silicon Valley bank collapse. You could use that inflationary cycle to get the Fed to have radical change in policy. And then you could wipe out the banks, the ones that you want to wipe out, and you could get exactly what happened in 2022. And it all comes down to, from my perspective, from my analysis, from following the money, can Trump stand up to his Zionist Congress? And can he stand up to the campaigners that paid for him to be installed in the first place, and his Israeli backers? And can he go America first, or will he be forced into Israel first? And you know what Israel first looks like. Okay. So I covered a bit more around, I've done the deals. And so when this was all escalating, your media may not have told you, but Russia, China, and Iran, while this whole nuclear deal escalation was happening, on the Western media, they actually held joint naval drills, basically around Iran's port. And so all of these drills are showing we're unified. America, focus on America. Israel, focus on accepting the deal and let the Palestinian cause happen, and we can all enter into this multipolar world. This collaboration essentially reflects the countries. They all have shared interests right now. And they all need to counter any US influence over the region. And this is what needs to happen. And this is what needs to be negotiated. US needs to retreat. This is what Trump promises. But will MAGA get all excited, and will be Trump persuaded into doing these neocon, even though he's not a neocon, because he's being forced through Zionist influence in order to escalate war? Just so you know as well, India in BRICS has signed a 10-year deal with Iran to fund the building of Iran's largest shipping port, to make sure that those routes across the Belt and Road Initiative are all moving forward. You're being told the BRICS can't coordinate, that it's just a talking shop. Meanwhile, it's all being built up. And that's why, multipolar is the way forward. Basically, this will connect India to the new Russian shipping lanes as well. So those brick corridors are being built up. Russia has created a new shipping lane, which essentially allows it to the West to basically export with no West, no control over it as well. And if Israel persuades the US into another forever war in the region, my analysis said that's how you get back to the Biden World War III, when it was Genocide Joe and Holocaust Harris. And that's all we need to avoid at this stage as well. Just America needs to be America first. Win the AI race. And that's how I see it at the moment. Okay. I talked we got a bit more of the understanding the macro section and how it relates to the geopolitical section. I talked in the macro section about my belief that the US is basically handing over the war machine to EU, but it wants the money to go back into America so that Palantir can push forward with the AI arms race that it's beta testing in occupation and genocide as a service in Gaza, that then can be beta tested into the European Central Bank digital currency as the proof of work network escalates, and America can focus on technocratic stable coins and the AI race as well. Kind of going into that narrative a bit of how I see the money flows. Russia basically came out, and after this handover, the Zelensky dramatic event that led to this recollaboration, Russia came out and accuses the UK of being a military, basically the primary aggravator in the Ukraine conflict. We know it was CIA, and we know it was a sacrifice of EU, and it was a proxy war to weaken Russia and weaken EU, which is why Nord Stream pipeline was blown up by CIA. But Russia's playing into that whole theatrics as well. Russia's foreign minister, Lavrov, he says it's very shameful that France and Germany were only buying, basically they were only buying time to send more weapons to Ukraine. Well, the theatrics of the Trump administration looks like they're negotiating peace, which they are. And I said it's about 70% truth, but they're hiding the whole point that this was a NATO prop up of the dollar and weakening of euro anyway. They can't tell that side of the story. But he's pushing out that, that Europe is not looking for peace. That ties into that narrative of pushing the Russian ruble industrial complex and the euro military industrial complex. Marco Rubio, he came out and said Ukraine demonstrated that their government is ready to take steps towards restoring a durable peace, and express that Ukraine now has a readiness to accept the US proposal and the rare earth deals, and enact an immediate 30-day ceasefire deal. Now, the ceasefire deal won't be done because it's basically not got what the original peace deal had, which is a border of any territory taken. Ukraine is going to have 800 billion. Europe is going to say, no, there's no concessions on borders. America wants to sell more weapons still, but they've got to get that the buffer zone. Russia will say, yeah, but we don't trust Europe and the CIA and MI6 to create lasting peace. And so we know it's a deal that can't be done, but we now need a way of showing that we can give the weapons to Ukraine, give the intelligence, get the money back into America, transition a war machine, make Europe look like the warmongers, make America look like the peace negotiators, and make Russia look like it's turning down the deal, all while escalation is happening as we get pressure into this to push Russia to go deeper and deeper and hopefully get a negotiation. But it won't be ceasefire, because ceasefire will remilitarize Ukraine to come back harder when Russia's already winning. And so it has to be lasting peace, and it has to be a recognition of what actually caused the war, which is a CIA operation to expand NATO in order to wipe out middle-class America, wipe out middle-class Europeans for the profits of the military-industrial complex, the banking lobby, the Israeli lobby, and everyone that controls those stocks, which are designed to redistribute wealth at the money printing of the central banking cartel. Okay. So what did Rubio come out and say? Well, as a result, we will immediately lift the pause on intelligence sharing and resume security assistance to Ukraine. Now, what happened in the meantime? Well, the area that Ukraine was occupying within within Russia, when they advanced, when Biden said you can have these, you can send our missiles controlled by America and Europe into Russia, which Russia said that's a declaration of war by US and Europe, which then led to the regime change where the Trump administration was installed. Ukraine advanced and started firing drones within Moscow. And then Russia came back and retaliated harder. And then now we're talking about this region that Ukraine occupied. And Trump's going on and saying 2,500 Ukrainian soldiers are killed. Russia's coming back harder as take back control of that region. And moving into those negotiations, they say it's because America wasn't sharing security. It's because America wasn't funding. So now Europe can come back and say, we'll provide $800 billion, and everything continues for the profits of the military-industrial complex. So now US has resumed military aid and intelligence into Ukraine. And now, all right, okay, that was the reason why that happened. And this is the justification. And now we move into ceasefire. But we've got to make it now look like Russia is rejecting the deal and not playing nice, and America is saving the world. Yeah, so we got drones fired into Moscow in coordination with all of that. And of course, the war machine narrative continues. Ukraine and Finland, they signed a new military defense cooperation agreement. This was on top of the Bank of England Proof of Weapons Network decided to create more issues for middle-class Brits by sending $3 billion of Ukraine and signing a 100-year agreement and agreeing to send $3 billion every year, while average British people are choosing between eating and heating because they're stuck on US expensive gas that no one can afford. And now they're deep into a recession as we enter into a stimulus through the war economy. And Putin's Kremlin came out and basically said today a 30-day ceasefire. This was yesterday. The 30-day ceasefire that was proposed by US with Ukraine is hasty, was our expectation. And then Putin came out and he released a video which basically accepted, because he knows that you can't not accept it, because the strategy was to release a video to make Russia look bad, make Ukraine and US look like the peacemakers, and Europe and Russia look like the violence, which is what America wants to do. The mission was to weaken Russia and weaken Europe. So Europe and Russia need to look like the warmongers, and Ukraine and America need to look like the peacemakers. And then you had that theatrics with Zelensky to transition to it. it. Okay. So Putin came out and said, right, we accept the ceasefire, but on the condition that we deal with what caused the war in the first place, which is his way of saying, Trump, you know what caused this. It was the CIA. How are we going to deal with that? How are we going to actually end the Cold War? How are we going to stick to what we originally agreed? And how are we going to deal with the corruption of the military-industrial complex? Or are we going to allow the military-industrial complex to prevail? That's what he was basically trying to say. So personally, I really doubt a ceasefire will happen, because that's where you just have Europe make more money, get more weapons across, and then Russia will take more land for BlackRock, for the rare earth deal, and for the International Monetary Fund debt-based slavery system that was the reason, and the financial weapons of mass destruction that the deep state were trying to get in the first place as well. So I think Russia continues, and hopefully we can get to a ceasefire. But we know, based upon my economic analysis, what we need for real ceasefire is Europe needs to stop being a bitch for America. It needs to stop calling Putin Hitler. It needs to take back the cheap gas. And then it needs to use its own rare earth minerals through partnerships with Greenland, through Denmark, and build its AI across the UK, and build across its different European regions data centers, and work with BRICS and Russia to get its cheap gas, build its defense, and work with America rather than sacrificing Europeans for America, while America is sacrificing middle-class America for its transition from the war machine that required foreign occupation to the local domestic AI technocracy. Okay. So what are we going to get this week? Basically, Trump, his envoy, Steve Witkoff as well, he visited Moscow. He's going to be visiting Moscow for a meeting with Putin direct as well. Trump said that the meeting went well, that happened today in Saudi Arabia. So this is all today. This is all hot off the press that we're getting. And so we're now waiting for what the outcome is of these negotiations in Saudi Arabia, and the outlook of that as well. So finally, we'll just cover a few more on the China side, and then we'll wrap up for this week. On the China side, China basically it carried out some big naval exercises to show its strength. And this was near Australia for the very first time. So NATO, if it's expanding through Europe, it is also expanding to Asia. And it is also, I believe, the plan behind the Israeli lobby. Israeli lobby wants NATO to push for reunification, to push the war machine there, and also use NATO, the European war machine, or the American war machine, to get American directly there to make sure they fight the war with the Middle East. And NATO would be Israel's weapon by controlling and blackmailing and bribing and using its lobby to control European leadership with the CBDC, and American leadership with the technocrat stablecoin and infiltration of the tech companies. Okay. Xi Jinping, China president, came out and said that it is now in talks to travel to the United States in June to have discussions with Trump. Now, there will be no humiliation rituals in that one because China is an equal greater power. We found out that their GDP was built upon building. Half of America's GDP was built upon this wasteful, unproductive corruption. And in the macro section, we discussed how that gets reversed and what's happening right now. But Xi Jinping will be speaking with Trump as well. And the tariff war continues. And that is everything that I've got for you in the geopolitical section of this week in Bitcoin, macro, and geopolitics. This is the arms race that is being fought. And always remember, as bad as it gets, you are alive at the most interesting and exciting time in financial history. Some are going to do well. Others are going to get wrecked. I want to make sure you're on the right side of this change. So do me a favor. I would like to transition with peace, love, and unity. And that means we need more people that own Bitcoin in self-custody, more people that understand how to transition in artificial intelligence, taking away your job, and how to combat yourself from the oppression of these central bank digital currencies. So if you would like more of that for your loved ones, then do a few things. Make sure that in case I get censored by YouTube, you've got your simondixon.com Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. I got loads of resources there that you can't get anywhere else. Join the podcasts. I've got one on Apple and I've got one on Spotify, so you can just download it and can notify you each week. And you can do it with no extra time while you're driving or whatever you're doing. Download it in the background. Also, follow me on Rumble in case I get censored here. And help me get to 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. Subscribe, hit the bell symbol, hit all so I can get that review. And most of my real-time content is done on X. And join me on a space when I join other spaces if you want to ask questions on any of this stuff. That's everything I've got for you for Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 74. I'll see you this time next week. Peace.